think I saw him join.
Yeah. Mhm.
Thank you.
All right. Let's get started. Is the film rolling or the video rolling?
Let me confirm. Gennady, are we good to go? Yes, Mayor, you're good to go, and I can read the notice and do roll call when you're ready.
All right. Please proceed.
The meeting for which this agenda has been posted will be held pursuant to and in compliance with the Virginia Freedom of Information Act, Section 2.23708.2, and state and local legislation adopted to allow for continued government operations during the COVID declared emergency. All participating members of City Council and other boards will be present at this meeting through electronic means, and members of the public can view the meeting at www.fallschurchva.gov/council meetings. City Council work sessions are conducted to allow council members to discuss upcoming legislation and policy issues, and the public is not generally invited to speak. Public comment may be sent to cityclerk@fallschurchva.gov. All comments are provided in full to the members of council and will be summarized at the next regular council meeting. And as a reminder, during the move of the FCC TV station to the new high school, we are not broadcasting live on the cable stations. It is live, however, on the website at the address that I provided earlier. And for roll call, Ms. Connolly?
Here.
Mr. Duncan?
Here.
Ms. Hardy?
Here.
Ms. Shantz Hiscott?
Here.
Thank you. Mr. Lickenhouse?
Here.
Mr. Snyder?
Here.
And Mayor Tarter.
Here.
Thank you, Council.
All right. Thank you, and welcome to everyone to the Tuesday, January 19th, 2021 meeting of the City Council. We're delighted you all are joining us this evening. Before we get started, today is a sad day for this country. We've reached 400,000 deaths from COVID, and I thought we might start our meeting with just a moment of silence to remember those folks and those who are suffering and those who have lost folks to that disease. And so if you would please join me in just a quick moment of silence to remember those people, I'd appreciate it. All right, thank you. So we do have a busy agenda today, and that means I think it would be great if we can just kind of keep on moving and not get bogged down too much, but a lot on the agenda. Why don't we go ahead and get started with the first item, which is Broad in Washington. Mr. Shields?
Thank you, Mayor. So tonight we do have Broad in Washington on the agenda, and the staff report focuses on the affordable housing voluntary concessions that have been brought forward by the development team of Insight Development. Scott Adams is on the call tonight, as is Maury Stern. I want to thank them for joining us tonight. The staff lead on this is Dana Lewis and Nancy Vincent, and we've been assisted in these discussions with outside financial advising from Ted Risher with Boundary Stone Consulting. So that's been, we've had discussions over the past week since the council's last discussion of this item. There are two things that I will summarize, and I'll turn it over to Nancy and Dana just for a little bit more detail. But the way the voluntary concessions, sort of the bottom line to them is right now, is that they are offering a baseline case of 6% of the units at 60% AMI that are spread throughout all the sort of the bedroom counts of the project. Staff noting what our demand is for city employees and city residents who are our top priority for affordable housing, has proposed an alternative of 9 studios at 40% AMI and 9 two-bedroom units at 60% AMI. the developer has agreed to that mix. And so that is one piece of news that occurred last week. And so that remains the staff recommendation for the baseline case. In addition to that, where we've had lots of discussions about trying to increase that number. And where we are in that discussion is the developer has created in the voluntary concessions an option for the city council to exercise prior to site plan approval. So presumably as part of site plan approval, the city council, by a separate action between now and June, could provide staff direction on using the basket of other community benefits to increase the amount of affordable units in the project. And so the price of those units is set in the voluntary concession, so that is settled. And the basket of community benefits is tallied here in this chart. And one comment on this chart is I think that we have left out the library and the Rec and Parks offer as well. So that's approximately $150,000 in addition to that basket that's listed there. So that's a quick summary of the way the VCs are listed right now. This would be an option that the City Council could exercise in the future. One last comment I will make is we've had some discussion about using our cash in lieu formula, and Ted Risher has developed a formula, and we are largely in agreement on the methodology of that formula. In the simplest sense, you just take the delta between a market rent and an affordable rent at the AMI levels that we're targeting, and that dollar amount, then you do a present value calculation on it, and that produces what that unit is worth today. All of these units, as council will recall, are offered in perpetuity for the life of the project. And so it's a long period to calculate that benefit. One thing that we have not resolved is that if we were to reduce the number of units and accept cash in lieu, we've agreed essentially on the methodology, but we have not agreed on a number in the same way that we have listed a number here if the city is to purchase additional units using that basket of voluntary concessions. That's something that the city asked for it to be exactly parallel, and we have not achieved that in the voluntary concessions that are before you. So that's a quick summary, and let me ask Nancy and Dana if you'd like to add some key points to this, and also Mr. Adams or Mr. Stern to add, just to make sure that we all have the facts on the table for the council's deliberation tonight.
So Mr. Shields was eloquent as always in explaining this, the affordable housing contributions. I just have two things I'd like to add. And first of all, Ms. Lewis can't make it. She has a parent meeting for her child. So you all just have me tonight. The first thing is that the reason that staff are requesting that mix of studios and two-bedroom units is because that's part of the unmet need that we see in the city. There is really no low-income housing options for city residents or for people who work in the city, except for one ADU that the city buys down for one household. So the studios available at 40% of AMI would allow for that option for the lower income households. And also the two-bedroom units at 60% would allow for larger households to be served through this program. The bulk of the current ADUs are one-bedroom units, so this would provide kind of an added. It would add to what is being offered to meet the needs that we have. And then the final additional point that I want to make is that when Mr. Shields talked about the cash in lieu option that is being offered, the language that we would like to see is to have that cash in lieu be at the discretion of the city. And so it's the initial iteration said that. Later iterations talked about an agreement between the owner and the city. It would be better if it was the city's option on whether to accept cash or units when site plan and when the time comes. So those are the two comments that I have to add.
All right, thank you very much. Let's go ahead and open it up to questions unless there's any other further comments that people would like to make. All right, questions from council? All right, Letty, you're up. Letty Hardy?
Yes, can you all hear me okay?
I think so. Are you speaking? If you are, we can't hear you.
How about now?
Yes.
Okay. It's one of those nights again. Thank you, Nancy. One of the questions I think that was discussed during Housing Commission was whether we have agreement that the alternative to baseline is agreed upon as kind of the equivalent value. Do we have that negotiation wrapped up?
Yes. So the developer Insight has agreed to you're talking about the 9 and 9, the 18 units as opposed to the baseline, which would be the market mix at 60%.
Okay, so that one's settled, so we don't need to worry about the baseline. And I hear you about kind of wanting to support kind of the 40% income levels, given that's something that we haven't done as a city. Second question, on the cash option, you mentioned that we don't yet have support, that right now we want the conversion to cash to be at the city's discretion. Yes. Right now, does the language still read that it's kind of a joint decision between the developer and the city?
Yes.
Councilmember Hardy or Mr. Mayor, is it okay if I jump in for one moment?
Sure.
Just to I guess clarify on that point before we get too far, and I apologize if this didn't come through in the discussion we had with staff last week, but we're fine with making the change that it's at the city's discretion whether to exercise the cash in lieu. The only thing that would be open for discussion is just coming up with what that final number is. But I think we're generally in agreement on the methodology for doing that. So just wanted to clarify that tonight on the record that we're fine with that change.
Terrific. That's good news, Scott.
Thank you.
Yeah, so Wyatt, though, that's the rub, though, right? The idea that we're setting a number right now, if we're to buy them, but if we decide we want cash in lieu, that number's not set now. Is that correct, Mr. Shields?
That's correct.
So that's the issue, really, are we going to say that there's essentially parity if we want to buy or if we want to sell, the number is set the same or it floats the same, but not one set and one floats, correct?
Yeah, that is we have not reached an agreement on that last point. And I don't know if Scott wants to speak to their reasoning for that, but that has been something that we've discussed, and we have a number for if the city exercises the option to purchase additional units. We have a methodology, but we don't have a final number. We have consensus on the methodology. We don't have an agreement from the developer on what that number would be if we were to exercise cash instead of units.
Okay.
Yeah, Mr. Mayor, I'm happy to explain a little bit further on the logic behind the two options. So for the option where you're buying additional units, and we're viewing that as something that happens today, it's a very finite basket of AMI and types of units that we've put out there. They're either studios or 2 bedrooms, and they're specific AMIs. To do a cash in lieu when we have options on the table today for a baseline and a mix of units that is spread across the entire mix of the building, and not knowing when that called option is exercised makes it very difficult for us to commit to a value. We've committed to a methodology, as Mr. Shields identified, a difference between the market rent and the ADU rent on that specific unit type, discounted back at a discount rate. But the market rates could be very much different 2 to 3 years from now than they are today, if the city decided 3 years today from now to exercise that option. Same for the ADU rent. So we thought it was simpler to agree to a methodology that puts some parameters around how we come to value, and then if the city exercises that option, we then agree on the price based on that methodology for the specific units that the city is electing to do a cash in lieu for.
But the delivery is going to be the same, whether it's whatever option is option A or option B, the delivery is going to be exactly the same time. Right? In other words, it's going to be when the project's built and whatever the time is at CO or at building permit or whatever it is, the exercise, it's going to be essentially the same time. The delivery is the same date.
I guess the delivery of the unit, yes, would deliver to the market at the same time, yes.
Yeah, I mean, I got to say, I sort of think what's good for the goose is good for the gander. And so I would say, if we're going to lock in something now with very low interest rates, then so be it. But then we ought to use that same formula now and pick a number, and whatever option we pick, that's the rate it is. And the city doesn't get the detriment of market changes in the next 2 years or 3 years. But I'll wait till it's my turn to speak further. But I just wanted to clarify that while we're on the topic. Letty, I interrupted you. My apologies, and you're welcome to continue if you have more questions.
Thank you. I like your analogy, though. So that was kind of where I was going is, besides making sure it's kind of the city's decision to choose cash, I want to make sure that the value unit goes both ways. So while we're talking about buying it at a certain value, if we convert it to cash, hopefully that value is the same. So, but the mayor also made that point for me. Thank you. So moving on, now that we've kind of covered baseline and that alternative baseline, moving on to the option to get more units. Wyatt, thank you for clarifying that we have an additional 150,000, I think, on that list. I guess for the record, I've mentioned this before, but I know we've gotten 1 or 2 comments with concerns that we might be looking at taking away crosswalks, for example, or traffic calming on stormwater. And so for me, those are not on the table. I think those things are integral to the project itself and things that we've kind of told the neighborhood would come as part of the project. So for me, those are not, I guess, part of, even though they're outlined as part of the concessions, those would not be on the table for things that we could use to convert or reallocate for affordable housing. That said, we've gotten a number of really great letters, and I think I've spoken plenty about this, and so I won't belabor the point, but I do think this is a great opportunity for us to really prioritize our values with dollars. Otherwise, kind of the equity talk for the past 8 months really is hollow. I think one in particular that really stood out for me is Peter Davis from the Housing Commission, and also kind of lifelong city resident and graduate of the schools, talked about how really we're not pitting housing needs against any other community needs. At the end of the day, affordable housing really is a community need and a housing and school value. So hopefully that's something we can take to heart and be ready to allocate additional funds towards affordable housing, get to kind of a really landmark new kind of threshold for affordable housing. I think 10% would be a great goal as outlined in the staff report. Not only would these be permanently affordable, but also really raise the bar for future development. So I think timing is now, and I would love to see us do that. That's it for questions for now. I know that we'll probably have other things to talk about for Broad and Washington, so I'll reserve that until we move to those.
All right, Vice Mayor Connolly, followed by Mr. Duncan. Vice Mayor Connolly, are you on one?
Mr. Snyder's hand was up before mine, as was Mr. Duncan, so I'll wait till they speak.
Okay, yeah, I tell you on mine it popped up in a different order, but sure. Mr. Duncan, would you like to go?
Sure.
We can't hear you, Phil. Are you talking? Phil, you may be muted. Phil, is your video muted?
Yes, I'm trying to fix it.
All right, well, we can hear you now.
Yeah, it's going off and on without me doing anything, so I don't know why. Okay, let me keep an eye on the mute button and make sure it doesn't go off. Following on what Ms. Hardy said, what I'm interested in supporting is a 10% ADU count. And so I'd send a note to staff this afternoon and ask them to do some number crunching. Basically, what I want to do is hit 33 units, and using the money that the developer has already committed, and the profit money for library, rec, and parks and schools. What I want to know is what blend of units will buy me the number 33. I'm fine with sticking with just studios and 2 bedrooms. So what I asked staff is to run the number on a count that would be 24 studios, 9 2 bedrooms. The 2 bedrooms would go at 60% AMI. 24 studios would be whatever blend, as I said, gets me to the number 24 within the budget that we have. I had just penciled out, 3 at 50%, 5 at 60%, 7 at 70%, and 9 at 80%. But those are just complete back of the envelope numbers. This is a math problem that I just don't have the data to finish. So what I'd like to know is, is that doable? And I'd love to be able to know that, before we get the packet together for if we're going to vote on this next Monday, so that I have a concrete proposal to put meat on the bones of what Ms. Hardy said about connecting our values to our budget. So that's all I have for right now.
All right, thank you. Mr. Snyder?
Sure, thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. I've been working on affordable housing since the 1990s. I've supported the Winter Hill development, and I was president of the Housing Corporation. I supported the major project that was defeated a few years back. And I think I was the first on the council last fall to suggest that with development projects in general, and this particular one, we should require at least 10% affordable housing. Well, that's not what this is. The reality is that what we've done is that we've allowed this to be gamed. And so we're now forced to choose not additional VCs for housing, but rather we, in essence, have to pay for this housing rather than the developer paying for it. So as important as housing is it more important than bus shelters? Is it more important than the safety provided by crosswalks? Is it more important than good schools? Is it more important than stormwater infrastructure? Is it more important than lot and street traffic calming? Is it more important than additional bike share? These are the kinds of questions which, in my view, were absolutely preventable had we and others on the council regrettably suggested that for the additional affordable housing units, we'll just take away some of the VCs already agreed to. We have the capability then, we have the capability now to assist that in addition to the VCs, we have 10% affordable housing, and that would be my preferred approach. It was why I proposed it in the past, and why I believe that's the better approach than allowing this conflict, unnecessary conflict among priorities in order to achieve the 10%. I would have added that to the voluntary commitments that were made before. The developer is going to make a lot of money from this project, and I think a far better approach would have been to increase the 10% in addition to the VCs, rather than set up a conflict between an unnecessary and preventable conflict within the VCs. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Vice Mayor Connolly?
Thank you. I turned my camera off because it seems kind of shaky, but you can hear me, right?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. So I think this is really creative thinking to look at what is the biggest, most pressing problem that we have right now, which is affordable housing. I think the voluntary concessions, as we have looked at them over the arc of voluntary concessions, have really provided great benefits to the city, and they have been part of a very successful plan of financing from our very first building, which was the Broadway, all the way through our most recent one. And the voluntary concessions that have come in because of these projects have helped us build and renovate our new Mount Daniel and the TJ addition, and I think even parts of Mary Ellen Henderson, and now our new high school. So those school capital contributions have been a huge part of the financing plan. And they've also helped us with funding for the library construction as well. So I think that the community needs some more education about what this means, because while it's clear to me and to others on council that all these voluntary concessions are part of a much larger plan that we have to keep taxes as low as we can and still be able to do really ambitious CIP projects. Not everyone thinks about it that way. And I just want to make sure in the next week, as we go forward with this, that we are really sharing with the leaders of these boards and commissions, the school board, the library board, and recreation and parks, as well as I guess the CACT for bike share and others, that if we decide to go forward with looking at voluntary concessions this way and putting everything into an affordable housing basket this time around, that doesn't mean that school capital needs will be ignored, future school capital needs, or it doesn't mean that future park capital needs will be ignored, but that we're trying to piece together a picture. And I just want to make sure that's clear to everyone. And I know, as Letty mentioned, we got some good letters and some people get it, and that's great. And hopefully those people can help us spread that message. But what I'd like, Mr. Shields, is there a chart somewhere of all of our mixed use development and what those voluntary concessions have been for each one? I know I've seen that, and how they have really helped us in this plan of finance.
Yes, we have that chart.
Do we have it tonight, or can we have it? Is it easily accessible?
I think I can put my hands on it, but I probably can't actually get it up on the screen to share it within any kind of a graceful amount of time, most likely.
Okay. I think that is just a really important part as we're changing things here in the last 2 weeks. We just need to make sure that the community fully understands so that there's not a huge amount of pushback or blowback or misunderstanding of what we're trying to do here. And I think we can approve these voluntary concessions with enough latitude to be able to continue to share this, that this is a new idea and this is what we'd like to do. And the money that comes in from all these different voluntary concessions, again, is part of a larger financing plan, not a handout to a certain library board to do programs. It's part of a much bigger plan that the whole city council has in mind. So I think that is a really key part of this that we need to make sure that we're doing on our end.
All right, thank you. Ms. Hiscott?
Thank you. I just want to add a few comments to what has already been shared. You know, being the person who joined the council in November, late to the game, if you will, I have definitely made my personal preference for supporting affordable housing known. I think it's something that's incredibly important that we bring other types of housing to Falls Church City. This is a great way to do it. However, you know, also based upon my history on the school side and ensuring that we have the capital to make all the improvements we've made in the past 20 plus years, I want to make sure that when we're looking at affordable housing, we're also looking at how we support our teachers in the community, how we can have those teachers and support folks and people who work there have affordable housing as well. So I don't think one doesn't negate the other. I think they can work in concert together really well, and that we should focus some of our efforts on that. So I'm also in support of using additional voluntary concessions to support affordable housing, and want to continue those discussions. I don't see this as something that we're trying to take away from what we've already promised in our neighborhoods. Traffic calming, things that are incredibly important to making this a successful development. But I look forward to having continued conversation to doing that. And I think it's really important that we do reach as close as possible to that 10% for affordable housing as we can. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh.
Are there any other comments or questions from council? Ms. Connolly, is your hand still up?
Yeah, I just put my hand up again. I just have one more question, and that relates to the CIP going forward. And I'm wondering, are there school capital expenses in the upcoming CIP? Maybe Ms. Mester knows this answer. That we can say to the school board that these are going to be covered under our usual CIP expenditures and wouldn't necessarily need voluntary concessions to pay for.
Wyatt, do you want to take that first or me?
I think we can summarize it pretty quickly that in the school board has submitted to Cindy a CIP that she has not yet put into all the format that we would present to the planning commission, then to the city council, but it does include a $3.5 million CIP request in 2026, FY 2026, for expenditures at TJ Elementary School, which includes an expansion plus a sort of a remodeling of the front entrance to that school. So that's the main one that is in the school CIP.
Okay. And we can assume that, however, is that 5 or 6 years out?
Yes,
That's right.
2026.
We're budgeting for 22 right now, so that's 5 years out.
5 years out. So, and then I guess in the general way that we fund things, in the past, would we have said we're going to use this voluntary concession money to pay for that kind of capital expense, or would that have been funded in a different way?
I mean, typically that is the city council's decision on the ways and means how to finance school capital needs. And in the past, the voluntary concessions have been part of that ways of means. And so that was done for Mary Ellen Henderson Middle School. That was done for Mount Daniel. And we didn't have any VCs specifically for the high school because the 10-acre site was sort of instrumental to that whole plan of finance, and that did not have additional voluntary concessions.
Okay. So when you have that chart, Mr. Shields, can you show, like, we got X number of, X amount of VCs from one project, and this is where it went to? This is what it paid for?
The chart that I have in mind, I'm not sure. There's not that many of them, so it's pretty easy to verbalize, but that's not actually in the chart right now. But we could do that.
I think that would be helpful to explain to the community what we do with these VCs. Thanks.
All right, other comments? Mr. Snyder?
Sure, thanks very much. A question from the city manager. What's the total cost of these additional units that are being proposed? So we know, can communicate with the community what the cost is in terms of losses of the other VCs.
So, that's because there's different options. They obviously are much more expensive the lower the AMI rating, and if you have two beds are more expensive than studios. So it's kind of a mix to get to where the council would want to go. If you were to go, here's what is proposed to the council with this structure, is that this does not need to be decided on January 25th. What this basically lays out is an option and sort of a menu that the council could then think about, do some consultation with staff on in terms of the best mix, but also further consultation with the community. And prior to June, provide direction to staff on how to exercise that menu based on the council's policy objectives. So that's what this structure stands for. If the council wants to speed that up, we could certainly do that and have that done, have that as a separate action, say in February. I think it's my personal recommendation that we not try to cook up exactly what the mix is and how we're going to pay for it out of this menu by the 25th, simply because it's worth sort of going through some of the different options and just making sure that we've thought it through more fully. So I just wanted to make that clarification, is that this decision does not need to be made, just like that.
Mr. Mayor, let me follow up on that. So we're being asked here to support an option that conceivably could deprive public safety, traffic safety, commitments made to the neighborhood and the stormwater fund. And yet that's going to be a blank number. This is no way to make a decision. How can the community communicate with us if they don't know what the effect is on the other VCs of what we're trying to do? What kind of public input can we get that will be really useful? So I, for one, think that it's a real failure to not give some indication to the community, if we're serious about getting their input, about what the costs are going to be to the schools, the costs in terms of public safety, because all of this, again, is a fundamentally flawed approach. I would have added the additional affordable units to the existing VCs rather than take away from the existing VCs. We have the power and capability to do that, and we should do it. Thank you.
All right, Mr. Duncan, and let's work towards wrapping up this particular portion of our meeting, as we have a whole bunch of other items to go through.
I understand. So a question, I guess. My understanding is the buckets that we're looking into are the school cap money, parks money, and library money. All the other cash VCs are not involved in this discussion. That's my understanding. If that's not right, somebody correct me. Second, the notion that we're rushing into a decision on affordable housing, which is, as Mr. Snyder noted, something that we've been talking about here for decades, and certainly, actively been shopping through boards and commissions for the last 6 months on this project, leaves me, wanting to earn the pay that I get by, coming to a decision point on this. People can decide differently. They can think differently. They can have a notion that the developer has more money that they can put onto the table. I think the applicant might have some thoughts about that, but I guess that's another question I have. Is the applicant willing to let us, look behind their numbers and assure ourselves that we're not getting somehow short shrifted with the package that we're including. Again, to reiterate what I started with, it's just a pretty simple math problem. What can we buy for the amount of money that is in those three pots that's in addition to the units that the applicant has already agreed to? And I believe we can figure that number, without a lot of extra time, and then we can present to the community what it is that we propose to do very specifically. I hope we can do that by next Monday.
All right, thank you. Again, let's try to wrap this conversation up. We do have a lot more to work on tonight. Ms. Hardy?
Thank you. I'll try to be quick. So I would support kind of what Mary Beth talked about, kind of the education effort. I would not want to wait until June, because I do think it's important for us to do this sooner rather than later. And so to the extent that we can get that chart on the VCs and kind of share it with our colleagues on the school board and other boards that may have concerns about our opportunity to do this, I do think this is a great opportunity for us to work with the school board and our library board and Rec and Parks to really bring that equity statement to life, rather than, again, talking about taking anything away from each other. I did have comments on things outside of affordable housing while we're on Broad and Washington, if that's an appropriate time to transition.
Yeah, go for it.
Wyatt, where are we with kind of the latest on the State Theater? And then I think another point was around kind of getting language in the VCs for the Whole Foods commitment as well as after-hour shared parking.
Let me turn it over to the developer for the latest on communications with the adjacent businesses.
Sure. So we've been talking with the State Theater, and I think had some very good back and forth dialogue with them. We did receive some financial information from them just this afternoon that we're still going through to try and figure out sort of what we think the the impact is to them, and trying to come to some resolution before Monday. I think on a positive note, I think there's a recognition that what we're trying to solve for is that 3 to 6 month period where there's not going to be public parking during the daytime hours. And so really looking at the impact to their business for that time period where they don't have access to the public parking that they currently have. At all other times, they're going to have access to the same number of public parking spaces, either on our site or within 100 feet of their property. So we're continuing to work with them, but I think have not made as much progress as we want, just because we just got the financial information from them this afternoon.
And then what about the rest?
Sure. So on Whole Foods, I think we're still looking at that commitment. I think we are comfortable adding some parameters to the definition of what type of grocer could come in under the existing voluntary concessions, and adding provisions that it is a full service grocer that's a national or regional chain grocer, and looking at some potential other definitions to, or bolster that definition of what a full service grocer is, so that in the circumstance that Whole Foods did not come into the project and there was a grocer that did not require changes to the existing plan, limiting sort of who that grocer tenant could be. In terms of the after hours parking, that is something that we've talked about with Whole Foods, and it's not something that we're able to commit to as part of the voluntary concessions.
So one thing I will add in terms of the Whole Foods commitment that is in the VCs, as we've mentioned in an earlier work session, the VCs do reference the conceptual development plan, and in looking at that conceptual development plan, that is a very precise plan for this particular user. And I have been, as we've been working through this issue, that reference to the user that is called for in the CDP and the specs that are in that CDP, I've actually become more comfortable with that as a guarantee of the grocer that that we're expecting at the time of entitlement. And council does know any changes to the CDP, minor changes, when can be approved by the city manager typically, but that would be a major change, and that would need to come back to the city council.
What in particular do you view as being proprietary to Whole Foods? In other words, what couldn't a Safeway do in the same box and the like?
Well, specifically the CDP references a Whole Foods. That's one aspect of the CDP that is, obviously aligned with what the city's interests are. Other aspects of it have to do with the specific layout that's been requested by that grocer. But I just note those two things.
But I mean, the fact that it says Whole Foods, are you saying that means it has to be Whole Foods because it makes notation to Whole Foods?
Well, The VCs reference the CDP, and the CDP references, that brand name.
Okay.
To be clear, from our perspective, we're not committing to a Whole Foods. I guess only a Whole Foods. Obviously, we have a signed lease with them, and that's what we anticipate. But if Whole Foods was to go away, the way that the voluntary concessions, and I think our intent with that is that it would be another full service grocer that could go in under the current configuration. But I think as Mr. Shields said, that was a space that was purpose designed for Whole Foods. And so just knowing the grocery market, it's unlikely that another grocer would come into that space without wanting to make changes to change that design so that it fit their specific parameters for what they're trying to achieve.
Well, I'm sure that they would prefer to make some changes. If we weren't willing to give them, I imagine at some point somebody's going to willing to hold their nose and go forward. And so I guess what Ms. Hardy was speaking about, and I think others as well, is that we need to strengthen the VCs and would look for some additional language in the near future and not just have it popped up on us on Monday. I mean, I think this would be great to get something, if you've got some revised language that you're considering with the city attorney or the city manager, to let us see that beforehand, because I think it is a concern of people. And I don't think we'd be here talking today, with the Shoppers Food Market or something. I think the idea is that there's a lot of things that are very exciting about a Whole Foods that might not be with other chains. And so I think people would like assurances that at least that style of grocer, whether it's upmarket or the financials associated with it or other things like that, are addressed in the VCs. So I would suggest, if you're able to give some thought to that, not springing us on Monday, but in the near future, I would recommend that.
Yeah, and just to be clear, I think as we indicated to staff, we intend to have revised voluntary concessions in tomorrow. So we will have language there. But I guess I'll just to sort of put it out on the table again. We have a signed lease with Whole Foods, and we believe a Whole Foods will be coming to this site. Based on their history, there's not a history of them pulling out of sites previously, particularly when they have a signed lease. I just want to, I guess, sort of put out there that, again, I think we're planning for something that is highly unlikely. And even in the unlikely event that a Whole Foods did not come into the project or pulled out, there's a very slim chance that we would be backfilling that with another grocer that wouldn't need changes that would require us to come back into the public process, or a different user or different use that would require us to come back into the process. I think that's the reason that the process is set up the way that it is, so that the city council, if our plans change, has the final say on approving those changes. But that said, we are looking at changes to the voluntary concessions to strengthen that definition of what could come in the unlikely event that Whole Foods did not.
Yeah, so I would just say the tighter they're written, the more likely it is going to come back to city council. I'll just give you two examples here in the city out of the few that are existing. The Target was supposed to be a Fresh Market, which didn't happen, and the case immediately after yours is a movie theater that's having some difficulty now, even with a signed lease. So, I don't know what that batting average is, but it's not really, crazy for the requests that we're making, and they seem to unfortunately come to pass much more often than we would like, or that we would think would be the case. So anyway, I would just recommend, if you can, to tighten up this language. I think most on council, Mr. Shields, would like to see that and have it shared as well. So it's not just Monday, we're seeing it fresh. Mr. Snyder, did you have a comment?
Yeah, sure. Really, just to follow up, already we're having the developer saying, quote, "We're not committing to Whole Foods." So again, we're shifting the risk to the city. we're getting nothing in return for that shifting of the risk, while the developer will make the significant amount of money from all the residential units that they're building. So again, I have a serious issue with these last minute concessions to the developer, allowing for weaker wording, backing away from a commitment potentially, not providing additional affordable units except if we pay for them, a still unresolved situation with the State Theater, and I suspect unresolved with the Lawton Street neighborhood as well. And here we are a week away when the developer knew that these were issues for months. So let me just say that without a resolution of each and every one of these, it'd be very difficult for me to vote for this project, considering all the risks entailed to some fundamentally important existing businesses and the loss of other key occupancies that we really wanted originally on this site. Thank you.
Right, Mr. Mayor, I'm sorry. To clarify that, I feel like that statement took what I said completely out of context. I think our commitment on the Whole Foods, we have a signed lease with Whole Foods, has been the exact same the entire time we've gone through this process, and has absolutely not changed. We are absolutely not walking anything back on our commitment. And in terms of the other issues that are outstanding, I think we've worked diligently with the city throughout this process and over the last 5 years to resolve every issue that has come up. On the affordable housing and the additional units, that was something that was brought up in January, and we have now come to a resolution and found a very creative solution to try and get to 10% of the units as affordable. And we're happy to do it. I think we have shown over the past 5 years that our goal is not to maximize profit for this project. It's to create a good project that is in addition to the city, that the city can be proud of, and that provides a lot of benefits to the City of Falls Church. And, yes, there are 3 issues that are still outstanding. That's because we've resolved, the other 200 issues that have come up over the past year and a half, and I think resolved them in very creative ways and have been, very collaborative with the city and with adjacent owners on coming to resolution. We've come to resolution with 2 of the 3 adjacent owners that were identified. I think that shows that we have a strong commitment to doing that. And I'm sorry that we have not been able to get to a resolution with the State Theater yet. But part of that is, we've not been, able to engage with them in the way that we've been able to engage with the other owners to come to that resolution. I think hopefully, they have now come to the table and we will be able to work something out. But it's not from a lack of trying or a lack of thumbing our nose at the comments of the city council. I think we've shown again over the last 5 years that we are very willing to take every consideration that comes up, every issue, and try to work through it collaboratively.
All right. Mr. Snyder, do you have additional comments?
I don't. Thanks, Mr. Mayor.
Okay. Other comments from other folks? Let me ask you about Lawton Street and the cementitious board or panel on that side of the project. Mr. Shields, has there been any new architectural renderings?
Mr. Mayor, there are not any new renderings for that facade. Is that correct, Scott?
That is correct. We don't have any new renderings for that facade.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to see if that is still got a high percentage of cementitious board. To me, that's still an issue. And so I would ask that you take a look at that before Monday and see what you can do to reduce that and to improve the quality of materials. I don't want, one side of our neighborhood to be seen looking at a lower quality, and that's, in my opinion, is a lower quality material than masonry and metal panel. So I would ask you to take a look at that in the near future if you're able.
Yep. Yeah, and I think on that architecture, I mean, we've tried to maintain the lower levels of that with the masonry materials, stone materials, similar to what we had the last time around in 2018. On the upper levels, you do have cementitious panels, but I think we've tried particularly at the street level and consistent with the last approval, to have those masonry materials, at the lower levels, then building up to the cementitious above that with obviously other accent materials mixed in as well.
I would just say my comment stands. So you're free to, do what you want at your own peril or whatever it might be. But I guess my comment would still stand. So any other further comments from anyone before we move on to the next item? All right, thank you all. And as soon as you have any new information, Wyatt, if you might happen to get either materials, voluntary concessions, please send those out to council.
Yes, we will do that.
All right, thank you very much. Let's move on to the next item, which is Founders Row. Mr. Shields.
Okay, thank you, Mayor. And so for this item, we do have Joe Muffler representing Mill Creek on this call. We also have Becky Witzman, who's been part of these discussions with me and with Mr. Muffler. What the situation is that the Mill Creek had a signed lease, as the mayor noted on the earlier case, with a theater for an 8-screen theater complex that would serve serve meals during the screening of films. That company with which they have a signed lease has declared bankruptcy, and theaters across the country are closed. The voluntary concession with respect to the theater guarantee as part of the entitlements was that the city had the ability to hold back 50% of the residential certificates of occupancy pending the commencement of the build out of the tenant improvements for that theater. That's a very strong incentive, obviously, 50% of the residential C of Os, and was intended to make sure that the owner delivered that theater. With the current environment, that is not so much an issue of willpower right now. It is just extremely difficult to execute a tenant fit out for a theater in the current environment. What the developer has requested is to maintain the commitment for a theater, but to replace that requirement from the C of Os to instead a payment into an escrow fund in the amount of $3.6 million, which would be released by the city only for the purpose of tenant improvements for a theater when a theater is signed up and begins construction. That's a quick summary. It is a very narrow issue, a very important issue. This theater was central to the entitlements of the entire project, but that is really the extent of the request from the developer. So I wanted to give that summary. Mr. Muffler's on the call, and I think he may want to speak just in terms of kind of where they are and recruiting a theater for this space and any other details on this request.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Shields, and good evening, everyone. Thank you for having us on here. It's good to see you all, even in a virtual setting. It's hard for me to sit up here and, as I put in the justification letter, pontificate on the state of the movie theater industry. I think that we all are very well aware of how badly that industry is struggling. Studio Movie Grill was a very reputable organization with backing from significant Wall Street, had significant backing from Wall Street, and they failed. They were not the first theater to fail. I don't believe they will be the last theater to fail. I think bigger brands will fail coming down the road. That's the negative start. That's kind of the bad news first strategy. The good news is, as we have detailed, we've engaged the services of a industry broker / expert, an individual with contacts throughout the industry at the highest levels. He has given us intel and insight and connections with other theater industry executives so that we can really understand what's next to the best of anyone's ability at this point in time. The crystal ball is obviously incredibly murky still. And to put us in touch with people who might have the interest in backfilling this space, because ultimately that's, I think, what this conversation's about, is we all want a movie theater here. We all know how important that was to not only the approval of the project, but to the programming of the project, to the way that we as the ownership and as the developer have approached the underwriting, the marketing, everything about this project has been tied to this movie theater. So we remain committed to doing what we can to find a viable theater operator if that is indeed possible. I can tell you that through the connections of this broker, we are having advanced conversations with operators to backfill. But I would like to impress upon you all that, and I'm sure you can appreciate this, the nature of a lease with a movie theater today is substantively different than it was 3 years ago when we signed a lease with Studio Movie Grill. The terms and the requirements could not be more different, and we are in the stages of negotiating, exchanging ideas and thoughts, really understanding what the industry comes to bear. At the end of the day, I firmly believe the industry, the market will decide what the market can bear. But at this point in time, despite the dire straits of the industry, there are theaters out there that are looking to take advantage, to expand, and it's a matter of, are the economics right for either side? Or, is it even feasible to make this work? So today, again, to summarize what Mr. Shields says, our request would be that we relax the restriction on the occupancy, which we believe does more harm than good for everyone involved, the city included. And we instead replace that with the financial incentive to say that Mill Creek will park cash in the amount of $120 per square foot. And to give some context on that, that is more than the tenant improvement build out for Studio Movie Grill. And it's about double what we're hearing for additional tenants, for tenants coming in as backfill. Money can move around in different buckets, which is why we want to use the original data point of Studio Movie Grill. And that money would stay in place until a theater lease is executed and beginning their tenant improvements in the space. So it's a one-for-one substitution that we believe is win-win. It allows us more time to go out and try to backfill a theater, which we know is important, while also giving the city, a successful project, allowing us to lease the other retail, lease the residential, as we work through this over the coming months. We know more today than we did 2 months ago when this news broke. We'll know more 2 months from now than we do today. So that's it in summary. I'm happy to answer any questions and to be as transparent as possible. I do want to recognize city staff, Wyatt, Becky, Paul, Jim, and Gary for their extensive help throughout this process, their creativity in finding a solution that we believe is viable and mutually beneficial for all parties. So thank you. Happy to answer any questions.
All right, thank you so much. Let's move on to questions then. City Council, who has a question here? Let me go ahead and Letty.
Hi, thank you, Joe. Thanks for the update. I also appreciated, that analysis paper that was included in the staff report that kind of talked about where the movie industry was and hopefully how resilient it will be, especially even after COVID and streaming technologies started kind of 10 years ago. Because I share some of the optimism, and I do think things will bounce back, but there is so much unknown. So that kind of is the backdrop. I did have a question, though, on the exact amount. So not being a theater expert myself on what exactly it costs to build a theater, I did some Googling. And so what I just saw really briefly, I think one site I saw said that the per square foot cost is around $250 or so, compared to the $120 I think is proposed here. Is that something that we can get benchmarked with what industry build-out costs are for?
Sure. So I'm happy to speak a little bit more to that. And there is no one answer to that, right? Because it just depends on how you're defining the budget for building out a theater. I can tell you this: we've put approximately $5 million into the theater where we are today, and that's the infrastructure that's in it. It's the box, it's the roof, it's everything that goes to where it is today. The box, as that theater stands today, is eminently adaptable for any future user. So that's the good news, right? We aren't so far down the road where we say we are boxed into a corner. No, we have an empty box that can be adapted for any remaining retail tenant. After that, it depends on the theater operator. I would tell you rough justice, you're looking at $150 to $200 per foot for full build out. However, in any retail deal, you want to, if you can, make sure that your tenant has some skin in the game, right? So that's the total cost of the remaining build out. So for us, when we went into this with Studio Movie Grill, we were posting $3.6 million, and they were going to cover a portion of that balance, whether on their own, through a loan, through financing, however they were going to do that remaining tenant improvements, they would take on for themselves. So that's the negotiation we're at today. Again, our goal is to place into escrow a reasonable amount of cash based on the data in negotiations with tenants. This is what Studio Movie Grill had agreed to once upon a time. And as we work our way through, discussions with future tenants, that's going to be always part of the negotiation. And it's exchange, you have different levers. You have your rent that's going to be paid, and then the amount of money that the tenant's going to be put into it, the amount of money the landlords are going to put into it. Those three things get negotiated to figure out, to try to make how to make a deal work. So that's the long-winded way of saying how we arrived at the 3.6 million based on Studio Movie Grill, what we've put in today, and then clearly the tenant will have to put some skin in the game as well.
Thank you. I guess my request to staff is it would be helpful for me before I vote on this to have some just data that shows kind of what build-out cost looks like in the industry. My second question also for staff is, as it stands with the language in there, what happens to that money in the escrow account if no theater gets built? Does it just stay there? Does the city get to keep it? How does that language protect the city?
So there is no sunset to this, and so it would stay there. And so the intent of this is to hold that for the exclusive purpose of a theater. And really, this is pretty single-minded in its approach to try to ensure that a theater gets in this space as originally intended.
Okay, that's it for now. Thank you.
Mr. Lichtenhouse.
Thanks. I'll just speak to this from a commercial real estate perspective. Letty, to your question, I think $120 for a base build out in a movie theater, considering the fact that there's already a concrete box there, that's a pretty good base build out. There may be some other money needed for furniture, fixtures, and equipment, but that's a pretty robust build out from my perspective. Just generally speaking, as it relates to this entire issue, I think that there are other folks on council here who are much more enamored with the idea of a theater than I am, although I'm very excited about that. I think it'd be great, and I'd like to use it. I think the reality of the situation is I'm less optimistic about Mill Creek and their broker finding a movie theater in the very near future. I think it could be a couple years from now. However, what I do know, and I am hopeful that you guys are successful, Joe, in finding that. But what I do know is that if the city council and the city and the intent and really what was the kind of the keystone piece for this project is to attract a movie theater, it is going to be very, very difficult to do that if that property is not stabilized. A lot of the operators are going to look at the physical foot traffic and bodies that live in that project to be some of the patrons of that movie theater. So, in one hand, not allowing for these C of Os to be released to put bodies in those units, we're in turn shooting ourselves in the foot. Trying to go out and find a replacement operator. So I want to make sure that's put out on the table. Again, I think a theater is great, frankly, personally, in light of the current environment and not being able to look in a crystal ball and know exactly what's going to happen with movie theaters and movie theater operators. I would personally be open to other uses, maybe things that we haven't thought about, things that may not even be really kind of a known entity for a year or two out, because again, I'm not as optimistic about movie theaters, although I do hope that we put one in here. But I support this, and I think that if our intent is to put a movie theater in there and to do it as expeditiously as possible, having as many bodies in that building as possible is what's going to help that endeavor. So thank you.
Mr. Snyder.
Sure, thanks, Mr. Mayor. So the 50% holdback on the units was a significantly effective tool to ensure that we got the commercial components that we wanted. Now the developer has come forward and says, no, we're not going to, we can't guarantee, please let us out of that. in favor of something less effective, which is 3.6 million amount of money. If we're serious about this, why don't we, in addition to that, require some additional affordable housing units in this project? I think just simply trading a stiff penalty for a less stiff penalty and getting us nothing in return is not good negotiating. So yet again, I have one client. My client is the city. And yet again, the developers come forward, says, oh, let us out of this enforcement mechanism, or we'll give you something else. And we get nothing for increasing the risk on the city. So I have serious questions with regard to what's being proposed here. And if we're really serious about affordable housing, let's throw that into the mix. Why don't we demand additional affordable housing in addition to 3.6 million? Thank you.
All right, Mr. Duncan.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I appreciate, Joe, your work in this area. I'm wildly optimistic that we are going to get out of this pandemic, which is the only thing that has caused the hiccup that we're facing right now at the movie theater, and that you will find a new operator, and that the world will look much brighter a year or so from now. If there's anything that can be done on the city side to demonstrate to the movie industry that Falls Church is a good market for them to locate, I know that you know the people who can give you that data and information, and certainly I think almost all of us, maybe all of us, would be willing to speak to our keen interest in bringing back to Falls Church an amenity in a movie theater that the city used to have. We actually used to have one in and two on the very near borders. And I'd like to see us get back to our glory days where we have a local movie theater that people can walk or bicycle to. And I believe you guys are still the ones to do it despite these difficult times.
All right, thank you. Are there other comments or questions? If not, I've got a few. One, I totally understand today's environment. I totally get it. And I'm sympathetic on one level with you. But I have to say, this project, I was heavily involved in discussions about the movie theater. And I'm not one of those folks who says, well, something else, let's move on. I'm not willing to do that. And so I would say to you, at least from my own personal perspective, I don't want to hear in a year about a really cool gym or some kind of play activities or something like that. I just that's not something I would have an interest in. And so I would say, at least from my perspective, I believe we can get a movie theater, and that I want to encourage you to use all your efforts for that. In the meantime, I want to make sure our interests are fully aligned so that there's no perverse incentive for you to park some money and just sort of forget about it. And it's, you don't want to sign a lease with a movie theater that you could get more money from, the kids' play outfit or something like that. And so I don't know how to structure that, but I do want to give some thought as ways to ensure that our interests are fully aligned. I don't necessarily want to be punitive to you all. I know this is not of your making, but I do want to make sure that you feel as strongly as I think we do as a whole about trying to get a movie theater here. And so I'm not sure what that necessarily entails, but I do want to make sure that we do all we can to make sure we get a movie theater. To me, it's part of a complete community. It's something that I felt was missing and do feel is missing from our community. When I was younger, I used to come to Falls Church and go to movies. And I think it's a great experience for our kids to be able to walk to a theater or bike to a theater. And frankly, that's why this project exists. If it was, as it originally has proposed, a Walgreens to be the anchor of this development, I can assure you that this would not have come to pass. And so I do want to make sure that we're working 100% towards that goal. So anyway, I'm not sure what else I have to say on the matter, but let's keep on working and try to come to something that gets us where we need to go. I suspect in the next couple months that things will be a little bit different than they are now. And I don't know how many months that's going to be, but my hope is in the not too distant future, there's a whole lot of pent-up demand for entertainment, for socialization, that may cause people to change their outlook on this particular aspect of business. So anyway, I think that's all I've got. Does anyone else have anything before we move on to the next item?
Mayor, I just want to say thank you for those thoughts. A lot of what you said we share. In terms of incentives aligned, I do want to emphasize this, at least for you all's reference, which I know we talked about it when we first went through approvals, but also just to put it out there again for the record for the for the general public. For better or for worse, we are the 100% owners of this entire project. The residential, the retail, the movie theater. And we put a substantial amount of value on the retail portion of this project. I think I put out there that it's more than a third of our bottom line revenue is derived from this retail. That retail is going to struggle in the way we envisioned without a movie theater. So we are very incentivized, regardless of parking cash, occupancy restrictions, or any of these other, accountability requirements. We are professionally and personally incentivized to do as well as we can on the retail here, to maximize our value, which in turn maximizes the value for the city. So I hope that we do understand that we are aligned in that capacity, and trust me, we will turn over every stone we can. We do believe, feedback from operators and from our consultants that the pent-up demand is there. It's a matter of getting people off the sidelines to take the risk and say, we're willing to sign a lease with the belief that a year from now things will be better, that pent-up demand will be realized, and then we'll be back to the way things were in no time. So that remains to be seen, but I assure you we'll do everything we can to turn over those stones.
I mean, along those lines, I suppose the market, or I would imagine the market has changed. In other words, the rent you were going to get 3 years ago is probably not the rent you're going to get today. And it probably is not the rent you could get from a 24-hour gym or some other use that would fit into this kind of box. I mean, that's my hunch. I would guess that's accurate.
That's accurate. There's a lot of variables into it, but that's of course accurate. There's value propositions in terms of how does a project without a theater do with a project with a theater, that rent notwithstanding, right? So it's a rising tides type of element. So again, it's a matter of getting the interest, and that's what we're out there trying to get.
What I want to make sure is that those other things don't outweigh, for example, the idea that, hey, you know what, we're going to lose X dollars of what we can get on the 24-hour gym. Because we're just not going to get as much rent. Movie theaters are not going to pay the same rent they did 3 years ago. There's going to be a whole lot of vacant space to fill up of theaters, and rents maybe, I wouldn't say dirt cheap, but maybe when they do start coming back. And so I guess I want to make sure that you have incentive, as you did before. 50% CO is a pretty big incentive. That's a massive hammer to want to fill that space up, even if it's not as profitable as it was before, or if it's not as profitable as other alternative things you could jam in, a concrete box. And so I don't think we have to go over it. I don't want to belabor the point, but I do want to just make sure that the point I imagine is taken, and that's something that I'll be thinking about going forward as well. And again, I don't want to be punitive to you all. I think you've been decent in our dealings. That's my experience with you and your company. And so, but I do want to make sure that we're fully aligned in our interests, and that even if it loses you money than what you're expecting, that you want to put that movie theater in as much as we want to have it there.
Well reasoned. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Anyone else have anything before we move on? All right. Let's go ahead on to the next item. Thank you very much for coming. We look forward to hearing more from you, Mr. Muffley.
Thank you. Take care.
You too. Bye-bye. All right. Let's go on to the next item, which is noise regulations.
Okay. Thank you, Mayor Tarter. Carol McCoskey is going to, I think maybe it'd be best if she took the lead just to talk about this update. We also are joined by Captain Steve Rao with the police department, and I want to thank Captain Rao. He has been enforcing this ordinance throughout the COVID pandemic, where we have had a higher number of noise complaints from neighbors with our business community having outdoor entertainment. And so he's been on the front line with our police officers, just trying to navigate that in a way that's fair to our businesses, but also tolerable for our residents. And so he is here just to speak to that experience. And we're also joined by Jack Villa, who's an intern with us, and he is a student at George Mason High School, and he has helped City Attorney McCoskey with some of the research on sort of what the best practices are and codes across the Commonwealth of Virginia. Ms. McCoskey, let you take the staff report.
Yes, I'll go through some of this briefly, and then Jack Villa, who's been very helpful on this, he's a senior, and I'll tell you all, he's going to be going to Boston College in the fall. I think he's been accepted to his #1 choice. But Jack was very helpful, and Steve Rao has also done a good amount of research on this noise ordinance, which has been, we have some fairly simple amendments for you tonight. I'm going to give you some of the background, and then Jack will go through the specific amendments we're proposing. But it's a longer history with this thing, because a number of years ago, the Virginia Supreme Court said that localities cannot enforce misdemeanor penalties for noise ordinance based on a finding that the noise disturbs a person of reasonable sensibilities. They said that's too vague of a standard for the criminal penalties of a misdemeanor, and therefore most ordinances regulating noise in the Commonwealth had provisions that were unenforceable. Ours did as well. Our ordinance also has decibel level standards, but for many years we didn't have a noise meter or anything that we could use to enforce those standards. And this fall, the police department has obtained a noise meter and has gotten some of its officers trained so that they can use it to measure the noise and establish whether there's an actual violation of the ordinance. So what we're really doing right now is recommending that council consider and adopt the changes that will remove the reasonable person standard that has been unenforceable for many years, for a number of years. And then we will proceed to enforce this ordinance. Captain Brown can speak to that more, using the noise meter and the decibel standards. So Jack is going to go through and tell you the specifics of the changes that are being proposed.
All right, welcome, Mr. Villa. Thank you. I understand you're a senior, and I congratulate you for still working past the first semester. So
believe me, it's difficult. It's not easy, but
congratulations on your acceptance as well. It's a fine university. So
thank you.
Very impressive. But what I understand from the city attorney and city manager, you've done extensive research on other localities and other jurisdictions about the ordinance and what other localities are doing. And so if you would, please share your research with us and your thoughts. We look forward to hearing.
Yeah, so a lot of what we've done here, especially with kind of looking at the decibel levels, we've been looking at other localities like Virginia Beach. Carol and I were talking about DC earlier today, Alexandria, Arlington, Fairfax County, and we've been looking through those to kind of match the decibels. And a big thing that we've been trying to look through, that, as Carol mentioned, was that a noise or disturbs a person of reasonable sensitivities. And that kind of, we need that changing that has had to change throughout the ordinance, throughout the prohibited acts, which we need to focus on. And we had to also change section 1451, which dealt with animal noise violations. And we amended it to create a definite standard for barking for animals. And that is that animals that bark at least once per minute for a period of 10 or more minutes. And this is the same standard that Arlington's using, and I think Fairfax County is using it as well. So that's another thing we found in our research to kind of use for animals. And we also found in our research that in our ordinance, we had a special provision for noise outside of hospitals, schools, libraries, and churches. And we didn't really find that anywhere else. And we found that it was unnecessary within our ordinance. So we did strike that. And we found that it also had language that kind of dealt with the reasonable person standard that was struck down. So we decided to cut it because of that as well. And we also We also define noise. We simplified the definition of noise and clarified it so that it's more noise is more neutral rather than noise disturbance, which is negative. And we simplified the prohibited act we simplified the definition of loudspeaker. So yeah, those are the big changes.
Gotcha. So it sounds like in summary, you've made something that was fairly subjective, more objective.
Yeah, that was with the help of the noise meters, I think kind of having those decibel levels helped make it more objective. And with the cutting of that reasonable person of normal sensitivity standard, which really doesn't mean much from a legal standpoint, we were able to kind of make it more objective, as you said.
Okay. All right. That sounds great. Sounds like you did some real fine work, and I imagine some of my colleagues are going to have some questions. So let's go ahead and open it up to folks on council. Any questions or comments? Ms. Hardy?
Great, thank you. Nice work to Jack. Congratulations on your acceptance to Boston College. So to summarize, it sounds like we have compared this to kind of neighboring jurisdictions, Carol, and this is pretty comparable to what we see our neighbors have with kind of the decibel levels.
Yes, essentially, I mean, there are very, I'm sorry, Steve, was that you?
No, you got it, Carol.
Okay, so there's varying levels in each jurisdiction, but they're consistent. For instance, in residential neighborhoods and residential zoning districts, the daytime decibel level is generally 65 decibels, nighttime is 55. Essentially, if you compared the similar types of locations and the type and the decibel levels for noise which is allowed, they're extremely consistent across all the jurisdictions. We really didn't find any outliers. I did, in looking at the DC ordinance today, it actually is very complex because it has these standard measures just like ours, like the 60 decibels. It has the general measures, but it also has then some exemptions for specific types of things that make noise and sets different levels for them. It's just a much more complex ordinance, but in general, our residential noise levels that are permitted are the same as virtually everybody, as are in commercial districts. The daytime levels, the nighttime levels, they're extremely consistent.
Okay, and our definitions of daytime and nighttime are also the same. I saw that it was 7 a.m. to 9 p.m. During the week and then 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. on weekends, or do we have any differences there?
I'll let Jack weigh in if he knows of one. I'm not aware of any that are substantially different.
Yeah, like Carol said, I think some maybe have an hour difference. Some might be 8 instead of 7, but other than that, it's really kind of, there's really no substantial difference there.
Right.
So I guess I'd be interested in that 9 p.m. on weekends, whether that's something that we have seen from our neighbors. Because I guess as we urbanize more, if there are residential areas that abut commercial areas, whether it's reasonable to expect that there might be music, for example, after 9 o'clock. And if that's something that's established elsewhere is good practice that neighbors have been satisfied with. Second comment has to do with that really complicated chart that I don't think I quite understand, but I'm glad you guys understand it. Help me understand what an example noise sounds like at 55 or 60 or 70 decibels.
This is
Carol. Just go ahead and scream right now. It's
like, is it like a lawnmower is 70 decibels? Like imagine the lawnmower running, like standing 10 feet away from a lawnmower. Like from your research, do you have some good examples? Help us kind of understand what this means, because where I'm going with this is for the average person and the average business owner or, homeowner or resident, this is very hard to understand, right? So if this passes, we'll need to figure out how to translate this to something that our citizens get. And so just as an example to educate us right now while we're talking about moving from this subjective to more objective standard, what are some examples of noises, I guess, that we might be familiar with? And then the second kind of request is how do we make this easy to understand?
This is Captain Rao.
Hi, thank you.
So trying to determine what the decibel level is at any given location at any given time is going to be difficult, okay? Because we may be talking right now at the volume. It also depends on how loud your speaker is. We may be talking at 55 decibels, okay? My wife is sitting 20 feet away from me, and if I put a noise meter over by her, it may only read 40 decibels, okay? Because of the distance it's traveling. So it's going to be kind of difficult to do that, but most of your complaints, your noise readings and stuff like that are normally coming from not just across a property boundary, but sometimes into a dwelling. So me sitting here talking like this and someone being 75 feet away, they're not going to hear me.
Yeah, if I could kind of jump in there, something that Steve noted. Yeah, I think that the fact that we're measuring it across a real property boundary makes it hard for us to give you a concrete example, because on a quick Google search, looking up 50 decibels is like an air conditioner, but that is not, that won't translate to someone measuring it on the street if it's inside my home. So kind of, it really depends on where we're measuring it from and how close it is to a boundary line. And I think that's where it kind of gets more complicated.
So it might have to sound like a loud air conditioner from your house.
Well, that might be 55 decibels to me, but it might not be 55 decibels to anyone across a real property boundary. So I think
the way the ordinance is written is that the decibel meter is held at kind of across boundary lines. Is that correct?
That's
yeah.
Clearly not at the source of the thing that's making the noise, because that wouldn't make sense. It has to actually impact someone across the boundary line. So imagine if.
Yeah, it's across a real property boundary.
Got it.
Please make sure you're muted, by the way, if you're not. We're hearing a little background noise. But anyway, sorry for the interruption, Ms. Hardy.
Great. And again, I'll just reiterate, kind of, if we can make this easy to understand, if and when we approve this and roll it out, just to make sure that both our businesses as well as our residents understand that. Because again, I get the move from subjective objective, but that chart, I think for the average person is probably really hard to get. And I think we want to make this easy to understand so people can follow it. My last one is throughout the ordinance, we kind of talk about things that we don't allow. Do we have exceptions for things that are kind of sponsored events or city approved kind of things that happen in our parks? So the thought of being able to do things in parks again brings me joy, and hopefully that'll be on the horizon. But let's say there's a concert in the park, and clearly music in the park is going to be louder than what the decibel meter says. If it goes past a certain time, do we allow exceptions in those cases for ourselves if it's something that gotten a city permit or city sponsored?
So who's controlling the ordinance? You can probably go all the way down to the bottom. I want to say there is an exception policy. Okay.
Yeah, if you tell me what line, Steve, I'll be glad to advance to it.
Let me see.
It's section 1454 in the ordinance, Cindy, right at the very, oh, it's not at the very end. Section
1454, that's line 359.
Thank you.
So this basically just it just says that any person may apply for a variance or partial variance to the provisions of this article, and then that just leaves it. It basically leaves it in the bailiwick of the city manager at that point to allow it or not.
Do we currently? I mean, not that we've had concerts in the park, but say those summer concerts in the park, do those aren't those an exception? Because clearly Cherry Hill abuts and is in R1A, right?
I don't think we've ever gotten a noise complaint about the concerts in the park at Cherry Hill. So I don't know if a variance has ever been issued for that.
I think it's just something for us important to think about, that, if this is events that the city puts on, we want to set a good example. So either we got to end by 9 o'clock, or we have to make sure that we've thought through noise implications too. Thank you.
All right, Mr. Lichtenhouse is next, and I would note that I think your parties Ross, are the source of most of our complaints in the city, as I recall. Is that right?
That might be about right. We've thrown some good ones. I do have some serious questions though, Mr. Mayor. Guys, as usual, thanks for your work on this. And reading through this ordinance in particular gave me a bit of a headache. It's a lot to take in. I just want to make sure I understand this chart here because I feel like that's what's driving a lot of the objectivity of this. The way that I understand this, if I'm going and looking at the continuous sound, the dBA, and the difference between that and the impulsive sound, am I correct? Because just doing a quick search with the CDC on what a typical decibel level is for certain types of things, am I reading this correctly that for those of us that use a gas-powered backpack blower in a residential neighborhood, we would be prohibited from doing so? Because if during the daytime it's between 60 and 65, that means we can't use backpack blowers?
I believe that and I have to go through this. Let me see, construction horns.
I was looking at small engine, small power equipment in line 260. And then going down to the decibel levels. That seems to fall within the same time frame. Can't use it after 9 p.m., between 9 p.m. and 9 a.m. But seems based on these decibel levels, we're prohibited from using those.
So basically what it's saying is it's kind of carving out an exception for that, okay? Because it just says that you can't use that small power equipment from 9 p.m. to 9 a.m., okay? And that's weekends, or 9 p.m. to 7 a.m. on weekdays, so as to cause a noise disturbance across a real property boundary. It doesn't say anything about daytime, okay? So what we run into is our construction. When construction starts at 6:30, they're using their chop saw out in front of the house. We go in there and shut them down. At 7 a.m., they can use it, because this exemption for this statement of small power equipment only speaks to using it during the nighttime.
But I'm going down and looking at line 320 on what says maximum permissible sound levels from stationary sources. And that chart leads me to believe that within the time frame that's allowed in the ordinance, so if it's between certain hours, that is still the maximum decibel level that is permitted. Is that correct?
Let me see.
I think that would be correct, that, if a noise complaint came in on somebody using, I don't think the police are going out to measure these things, but if a complaint came in on somebody using that and it was measured as across a property boundary line to be exceeding the levels, that would be a violation of the ordinance.
Yeah, so that's where I have a problem with this is the decibel levels, and it gets tricky because we're a slightly different animal than some of our neighbors, neighboring jurisdictions, and these decibel levels, and there's almost been parodies of disputes that have taken place in certain jurisdictions, and the backpack blowers are one of them, where folks are calling the police on either the lawn care people or the neighbors because they're using a backpack blower in the fall. And I have no desire to unleash unintended consequences based on a chart like this, because again, for many of us around town that use backpack blowers, and in the fall we got a lot of leaves, someone could technically call the police, and if Captain Morale showed up at my house with a decibel reader, then they're going to shut me down, and I don't want that to happen. In addition to that, I'm looking at the decibel levels, and I'm looking at some of these zones, and according to the CDC, technically a washing machine is 70 decibels. Normal conversation is 60. And so, again, I don't want to legislate I don't want to legislate in such a restrictive way with our businesses and residences that the police are running around with this sound meter and folks are calling the police on neighbors simply because they got too many people gathering outside. And so, I know that there's going to be some degree of subjectivity with the folks that are out there reading it, but I have real concerns over this, and real concerns in the fact that we're not permitting our businesses to have any leeway, especially when we're encouraging people to move more of their operations outside in light of the current environment. And while I am certainly sympathetic that I don't want to sound like I've got a Grateful Dead cover band in my living room because of a business next door, on a Friday or Saturday night, shutting it off at 9 if somebody has live music is effectively, that's killing in some cases the most profitable nights for a particular business. So 2 things that I would ask. 1, I'd ask that we take a really hard look at the decibel levels. And then 2, I would like to expand the hours on a Friday night or a weekend, at least for our businesses. And I don't know, it sounds like Carol and, I'm sorry, is that Justin?
Jack.
Sorry, Jack. You guys have spent a lot of time looking at the language. Ask you to look at it a little bit harder to find some of those provisions. It'll give us a little more flexibility, because I really would not like Chief Gavin and her force showing up in my house on a fall weekend because we've been using the backpack blower for too long. And technically, according to this chart, that backpack blower is going to be in excess of 80 during the day continuously, and it wouldn't be allowed.
Okay. Understand the chart is what's been in our ordinance for many years. And we would have to potentially get somebody who can really study decibel levels to recommend making significant changes. Timing is one thing we can certainly consider, but we can take a look at it and come back to you, because I certainly understand what you're saying, but it was not something that we did look at it for consistency to make sure we're not out of line with what other jurisdictions are doing, but these are going to it's a lot of science to study exactly what the right decibel level is. Yeah, we'll take a look at some of the other provisions, like the timing. The weekend timing is maybe something that could be opened up.
Yeah, and I appreciate that, Carol. One last question for you. In terms of how the expectation of how this is read, when it says going across real property boundaries, does that mean you're standing just on the other side and you've got a decibel reader, and if it reads beyond what's allowed, then someone is in violation? Like at what point is it right up against the line? How does that work?
Well, I think it would depend on where the complaint comes from, and Steve may want to speak to it as to how they would handle that kind of situation. But technically, yes, if it went across a real property lot line, they could be just on the other side. But I think the police would probably be looking at it more from a, reasonable perspective. But what it does do is make it clear that you can't, unless someone sets up their noise right across the property line, you don't go right up to the source of the noise to measure it. You measure it from where other people who might not be involved perceive it. So okay. Steve, I don't know if you have anything to add.
So what we're trying to do from an enforcement perspective is if we receive a complaint, we are trying to allow get the person to allow us to come inside the house or where they believe, so to speak, the violation is occurring, in the sense if they're sitting in their living room and they hear music coming from a venue, do we go to their backyard to the fence and measure it, or do we go from inside? We'd prefer to go from inside, okay, to get that measurement. Now, the way the code is written and the way the code, it's kind of standard throughout the area is it just says across a real property boundary.
Okay.
Could we measure it from their backyard? Absolutely.
Okay. Yeah, I will just say that while this has been on the books for a while, and it seems like I would imagine we haven't had too many complaints up until, I guess, recently, it sounds like, which is why we're revisiting this. Once this is debated, like many ordinances that seem to sit relatively quietly on the books, once this is opened up, I think folks are going to expect more enforcement, and we would expect more calls. And so I want to think very carefully about making any changes that would be detrimental. If we are, let's put it this way, if we're going to make changes, making sure that it is accommodating for what actually takes place in the city. The thing that frustrates me the most is that the things, the noises that bother me the most are the cars coming through the city and the loud motorcycles, and they're disruptive. And then by the time you could get around to stopping somebody, they're already gone. But in any event, I want to think carefully about any provisions that we make. And so I'd like to see some of those changes in an ordinance to allow some of that flexibility and to make sure that we don't become the anti-leaf blower, anti-pressure washer town in Northern Virginia, simply because now we're 10, 15 decibels beyond what's allowed in this chart.
Just following up on that point, you did look at other jurisdictions, right? I mean, are these numbers the same as our neighbors, or are they more restrictive in general?
In general, these are the same. I mean, there might be a 5 decibel difference, in some places, but other than that, they're the exact same. And I think, considering that this chart has been implemented in Fairfax County, Arlington, Virginia Beach, or very similar versions to this chart with these numbers, and they haven't seemed to have very problems with restricting blowers or pressure washers, I think that we came to the decision that these numbers were okay. But I mean, this is obviously up for discussion. So
yeah, I will tell you, Jack, because I work in real estate and I've done some work in downtown DC, and people are very particular about using gas-powered pressure washers when during the day if they exceed decibel levels, and the same with backpack blowers. So Falls Church is a unique place, and this may be okay in places like Virginia Beach and in jurisdictions that don't have as much of a main street or densely populated town like Falls Church. But I can assure you, if this hits the books, folks are going to want to enforce it to the nines, because we've seen that with other ordinances. So I just want to think very carefully about that. And I, for one, there's a lot of things that we can take from our neighbors, but I certainly don't ever expect to remain in lockstep with them. If there are things we need to do that are unique for Falls Church because we are unique, then let's do it. So I just want to be very careful in thinking that through. But thank you, guys. And Jack, thank you, and congratulations on attending Boston College in the fall. It's great.
All right, Ms. Hiscott. Ms. Hiscott, are you there?
Thank you for your work on this, Jack. It's nice to see you on the call tonight. I appreciate all you've contributed to the community. And I just wanted to add to what Ross was saying. I think that if we're looking at revising this ordinance, it should be reflective of what's actually happening. I mean, if we already have leaf blowers out, and we already have things that are exceeding those decibels, and we know that, why are we, if we're going to redo this ordinance, we should redo it so it reflects what's actually happening in Falls Church City. And what's actually happening are decibels above these levels. We're pretty sure, even without going through extensive data, you can acknowledge that that's what's happening in a lot of our neighborhoods, like Ross said, just did in lawn care alone. So I just want to make sure that we, maybe that's not what's happening in other jurisdictions, so we don't necessarily want to be copying them if it's not reflective of what actuality is, right? If we're going through this process, we should make it work for what's really happening. And then also talk through what enforcement means. Like, when do we want to be enforcing it? When do we want to have our police out making calls? What, at what levels? And again, how are we supporting our businesses and keeping their music venues outside? How do we have our residents enjoy them without interfering with neighborhoods that are close by? We want to support both. And how do we do that effectively? And I think that's what this ordinance needs to address. I also, I guess I don't really understand what the enforcement is, what the penalties are for, maybe this is in a different part of the ordinance they didn't pick up on, but, learning what the enforcement mechanisms are and what the penalties are for doing this is important as well. Like Ross said, if it's just showing up and saying turn it off, that's one thing. If it's X number of times? Do we have what's our process for enforcement? And then Carol, I was hoping that you could just comment in this forum about how we have, I think there are like 50 houses that have generators in Falls Church City. And that's been a concern of some of our residents. And there's certain things we can do about that and certain things we can't. So if you could comment on that as well during this meeting and during this discussion of the ordinance, I think that'd be helpful too.
Okay. All right, so let me just, let me briefly address levels of enforcement, because and Steve may speak to this in the end more, because he knows as a practical matter how they do it. There is a penalty provision that's been in the ordinance. It's not proposed to be changed. It's not, so it is not called out there, but it is at around lines 411. But those are the penalties. It's a misdemeanor, so it would be a fine. I think the police, my understanding is generally they would not be citing somebody for a violation the first time they went out, but would try to get compliance. That's how we handle all of these types of violations. But there is a penalty that could be imposed with a fine after taking them to court and establishing the violation. With regard to generators, so right now we have not proposed to change anything in the ordinance with regard to generators. I know that there is an issue with some property owners, and I know that there's been some desire to try to affect how permits are issued for generators by the building permits department. Their building code authority does not allow them, or really provides no basis for them to look at how much noise can a generator put out. And so they are not prohibiting somebody from installing a generator that might create more noise than would be allowed under this ordinance. That would have to be a separate type of enforcement. And that's an ongoing issue. I mean, I don't know what, council's desire or the manager's desire is really in terms of fixing that problem, but it seems to me we would need to enforce, now that we can enforce the decibel levels because we have a noise meter, and I would think we might want to get a little time of seeing how that works, because there is this question of where do you measure the noise from, and is the generator really violating the ordinance depending on where it's located and how much noise it's making, which I don't think, we haven't had anything to measure the decibels in the past, even though these standards were in the ordinance. And so I'm not sure we have any good information about how that really works and the extent to which it's a problem.
Are we currently collecting fines for noise ordinances? Do we have revenue for?
I don't think we've had, we've had a lot of provisions that we couldn't enforce in the past because we couldn't enforce the reasonable person standard under the Virginia Supreme Court decision, and we haven't had the machinery or the training for officers to enforce the decibel levels. So Steve, I don't know if you're aware of any citations that have been issued to people in recent years. I am not, but I'm not certain that I would be.
Yeah, I don't know if we've issued any. Maybe a couple, and we may maybe even a couple just in the last couple of weeks. I'm not sure of that. The numbers I can tell you is that since the beginning of 2019, the police department itself has responded to 457 noise complaints. Okay. So that's basically a 2-year period and then 3 weeks of 2021. Those can be anything from loud parties, trash trucks, restaurants, loud neighbors in a multi-unit dwelling, alarms. Yeah, when I say alarms, I mean audible exterior alarms, either cars or houses or businesses. The enforcement portion on the police department is normally an advisory, to turn the music down. When it comes to trash trucks, to say, hey, you can't dump trash you can't can't pick up the trash before 7 a.m. You get these trash trucks that come in and they just pound those metal containers all over the place. And most of our enforcement, I would say, most of the time they're gone by the time we get there. That's number one. Number two, the enforcement is normally, hey, you're too loud or you're operating outside of the the prohibited acts. It's 7 in the morning on a Saturday morning and you're mowing your lawn. You're not allowed to do that. You got to wait till 9. We're not throwing a noise meter on them. We're just saying that it's a specific prohibited act to use that device before 9 a.m. on a weekend. So yeah, as to how much we're getting a lot of complaints but as to enforcement action, I would say our enforcement action is telling people to knock it off.
Thank you.
All right, Mr. Snyder.
Thanks a lot, Mr. Mayor. So I think it's worthwhile to recall why we're even discussing this for 2 reasons. One, a business felt that the enforcement was too strict and threatened to leave the city, while other citizens affected by the same sound that it was too loud and raised a citizen complaint. So the reason why we're here is because the current situation has created issues on both sides, both the creator of the sounds and the person who hears them. So I think that's useful to start off with, at least in the sense of some in the business community and some of our citizens, the current ordinance and its way of enforcement is not working. So we look to other jurisdictions, as I understand it. Has there been any outreach to these other jurisdictions as to their success and the number of complaints they've gotten, how they've resolved those complaints? In other words, one of the arguments for the proposal is we're using their numbers. My question is, did their numbers work to avoid exactly the situation we are trying to address here with this, which is a complaint both from the business that had the music and a citizen living nearby? So could the people who worked on this ordinance tell me about what they learned from these other jurisdictions whose numbers we're borrowing?
So no, I haven't done outreach to the other jurisdictions. My counterparts in law enforcement, normally in our neighboring jurisdictions, our counterparts in law enforcement do not, for the most part, handle these type of noise complaints when we're dealing with a business emanating noise across real property boundaries. Most of that is done by a zoning team. And so they have tools, and they've got all of their zoning rules and everything like that that they bring to the table. So I can't speak to anything that has happened because of COVID that has driven more noise outdoors and thus causing more noise complaints to a multi-use community, meaning residential and mixed use, that then causes more noise. I don't know.
So perhaps to the others, and Officer Rao, I know you have a lot of important law enforcement functions, but I think to the others who have worked on this, it might be useful to contact those jurisdictions to determine, all right, these numbers, which we're now adopting, do they actually work in your jurisdiction to prevent exactly what we're trying to prevent here, which is an unproductive conflict between a business and some of the residences, because we really want to try to uphold the interests of both. So if we're going to try to do that, and address issues that have arisen under our current ordinance, and we're borrowing numbers from other jurisdictions, it might be important to learn how those other what is the actual experience of those other jurisdictions using and applying those numbers, and what can we learn from that as well. So those would be my questions. But again, I think it's useful to recognize why this is on the agenda. I didn't particularly advocate it, but I think there's reasons why it is on the agenda, because something isn't working with the current ordinance.
And I just want to add that one of the main reasons that I've brought it up on the agenda is simply and that's why we have sort of simple changes only, is as a cleanup to address the fact that some of our ordinance as it exists is unenforceable. But certainly as we're looking at it, all these other issues are out there, but they will take, somebody spending a good amount more time, I think, to look exactly at what the decibel levels mean, and also at the experience of other jurisdictions. These are the same numbers that we've had for many years, but they are consistent with the other jurisdictions, and we can certainly get more input from them on those issues.
Right, and Mr. Mayor, one other comment. I think the 9:00 p.m., if it's the right standard, the 9:00 cutoff is too early. In other words, if the standard really is a reasonable one for surrounding residences, a 9:00 cutoff just would unnecessarily harm businesses. So it's the decibel level, it's how it's enforced, and what are the hours of enforcement that I think are all kind of moving variables here, but are things which hopefully we can resolve. Because again, I want to go back to, I think what the city attorney is helping us respond to is the fact that in today's environment, the ordinance is not serving, or is perceived to serve, everyone's interest as well as we would like. Thank you.
Okay, other questions or comments? So I would just say, I guess a question or two. These numbers are not being created, they exist right now, correct? In other words, these numbers are already on the books.
That's correct.
Gotcha. So really what we're trying to do is make them enforceable and make them be an objective standard, not a subjective standard. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. So to my mind, that goal, I think, is really kind of indisputable. I don't think anyone would say, well, we don't want to have objective standards. We're going to kind of wing it. And so I think the question before us is, are these numbers correct? Do we want to tweak these numbers? Is it too early? Is it too little? Should there be an exemption for temporary lawn equipment? And those, I think, are reasonable questions, and questions we should be considering ourselves and seeking input from other jurisdictions. But I do think it's important that we come up with an objective standard in the near future, because it's in everyone's best interest to know kind of what the rules are. But I guess I would just suggest, as others have already, that maybe staff and the rest of our gang here spend some time trying to figure out if some tweaking could be done for some of the concerns that have been raised tonight, and then bring this back to us, and we'll revisit it.
Yeah, because I think the objective standards are in there together with the subjective standards, and so they can be relied upon when we need them. And then in the meantime, we should look at tweaks that can be made to get something more what everybody's requesting.
All right. Well, unless there's anything else, let's move on. Mr. Villa, we thank you for your excellent work here, and congratulate you once again on moving on to the next phase in life. And hopefully we'll hear more from you when this comes back to council. But anyway, thanks to you all, Officer Rao and Ms. McCroskey. And let's move on to traffic calming, the next item on the agenda.
Mr. Mayor, as we move to NTC, this is Cindy, and while Jack's still on, I want to acknowledge he's also expanding his internship opportunities with the city, and will be working with me and the Legislative Committee of Council. And we're going to have our first sort of planning meeting this week, so I'm looking forward to working with Jack on that as well.
probably didn't know what he was getting into. He reached out to me a month or two ago, and so be careful what you wish for. But anyway, that's great. I'm sure you'll do some fine work with that. So are we now moving on to traffic calming? Is that next on the agenda? Or I didn't catch the first part. Ms. Messner, are you ready to move on to that?
And I would, let's let Cindy introduce this item, and then Zach will give the presentation. Cindy, sorry to put you on the spot if you don't want to introduce it, but you've been doing great work on this.
I'm glad to. I just needed to get off mute myself. No, I'm pleased that we're able to provide this update to council. Zach Bradley has been working with Jeff Sykes on the NTC program, and with council's request for an update. I think it's good timing because we will be updating the CIP and bringing that to the Planning Commission and Council, and this sets a good foundation for the work we've accomplished. Council had been very clear in the last CIP adoption that funding was committed. Our goal was to clear the queue. As Zach will touch base on some of the specific dollar amounts and where we were. COVID hit, it slowed down the dollar amount, but we continue to work with the community. Pleased with the good progress and the information Zach is going to be able to share. I think we've also expanded the staff resources to the NTC team so that we can manage this going forward with Zach and Jeff, and then we have another DPW engineer, Scott Frieda, on the team, and from CPEDS and planning, Cameron has joined us, which gives us a lot of good graphic work, and then we have Susan for OCOM to help us message and make sure we're celebrating the good work. So with that, Zach has put together a nice presentation to give you a good overview on where we are, and then we'll look forward to any questions or comments as we move into the next budget cycle. Zach. Just let me know when to advance.
All right, thanks for the introduction, Cindy. And as Cindy stated, I do want to thank everybody else in the NTC team. This is definitely not just between Ms. Messner and myself. So with that, if you want to go to the next slide, Cindy.
Yeah, I'm trying to get it to come up and show. Sorry about that. It's showing on my screen, but not for council. See if I can get it to toggle. There we go.
Cindy, my screen is only showing half the PowerPoint, half the. Is anyone else having that problem?
I'm still only seeing the first slide.
Okay, so maybe it's just my screen.
I'm going to put it in full mode and see if that helps with everybody.
Is this the same as what's posted?
Yes.
Because now it's
okay. I'm showing it on the presentation screen. So Zach, how are you seeing it? And then if it's good for you, we could proceed.
Yeah, I think I'm good on my end. If you want to try to advance the next slide, I'm still on the opening slide. All right, I think we're all set. All right, so I did frame this as what we accomplished in calendar year 20. With only being a couple weeks into this new calendar year, figured that was the best way to go about it. During last year, we did deal with 11 total projects. Out of those 11, 6 of them were finalized, constructed, and completely closed out. Another 2 have very minimal work left. One has a crosswalk to be striped, and another one has a curb ramp to be installed, and then those will be able to close out, which leaves us with 3 remaining projects. Those are 2 of our bigger ones, as well as our newest project, which I'll give the details on in just a second. And the existing funding between what council instructed us to unfreeze and lift our administrative hold on late last year, coupled with the incoming funding with the new CIP Cindy will be presenting, is currently sufficient to cover all of the projects in queue. Next slide. So currently we have $636,000 for Greenway Downs neighborhood. That is, we expect it to be fully funded. We don't see any issues with that. Obviously, if there are any extra funds left over or a lack of projects, those can be dedicated to that to expand the scope as needed. As of right now in local funding, we do have $440,000 available. $48,000 of that did come from the 301 West Broad Street development. That's from a voluntary concession that they had that we were finally able to work through some details. And that transfer will be finalized on the next budget amendment that'll be before council in the next month or two. But I did go ahead and account for that. We have about $350,000 in expected construction cost, and that is for light solutions for South Oak, South Lee, the Great Falls, Little Falls neighborhood, and a possible CACT appeal of the North Oak Street project, all of which I'll detail later. And then, as I stated, we'll be getting an infusion of cash to the sum of $100,000 in FY22 to further fund the project. Next slide. So these are a list of all the projects that we dealt with last calendar year. All the ones with stars on them are ones that have been completely closed out. So you can see Great Falls, Little Falls is still underway. Greenway Downs is still underway. Nolan Street is currently under construction. And then Seton Lane was closed out with South Lee, South Oak, and Maple Ave being the only two new added projects that are still yet to be closed out. Next slide, Cindy. So of our remaining projects, the two we currently have under construction are South Maple and Nolan. I do want to state that we did add South Maple and Nolan South Maple and Seton to the list. Those did have some traffic calming properties to them that were quite significant once completely built out. So we did feel it prudent to add to the list. But South Maple has one curb ramp remaining, and Nolan Street has a crosswalk remaining to be painted. Once the weather warms up, we'll be able to address both of those relatively quickly and close those out. The three projects we have in design are Great Falls and Little Falls. That is a project that it's got quite the study area in terms of size. There's about 95 houses in total for that. And we have struggled getting enough votes received to move it forward. Staff, especially Jeff Sykes, has been working with the CACT in recent months to come up with an alternate plan. We did finalize that at last week's CACT meeting, and we are going to break this out into multiple smaller projects. I believe this is going to, in essence, become 3 small projects that are all going to have a concurrent approval path so that for purposes of construction, we can treat them as one project, which will save us some significant money on mobilization, maintenance of traffic, and some E&S costs. Greenway Downs, that's the federally funded project. We've been working with the neighborhood. We did receive a survey from them last year. We're currently working to set up the working group in that neighborhood. Here in the next couple of weeks, we do expect to send out a flyer to the neighborhood to kind of formalize where we're at, and also to start receiving proposals based off of the neighborhood study that we received. I also want to note that South Lee and South Oak, this is our newest project that we have. So I know there's been some interest in this. It is lagging behind the others simply because it is the newest project. This is one that it's been kind of odd. We've dealt with this through COVID. Light solutions have been relatively easy, but heavy solutions have been a bit tricky with the change in traffic volumes and traffic speeds. So traffic does appear to be getting back to normal. So we are moving that project forward again, which I'll detail here in a little bit. Next slide, Cindy. So one of the first projects I'd like to highlight is the Lincoln Ave restriping. This was an NTC project that was undertaken several years ago, and the paint had faded out there. So we went through, we freshened up all the paint markings. It's helped out tremendously in terms of visibility and delineation of the lanes. And then this is kind of in preparation for a future CIP project to give Lincoln Ave some restoration and some stronger pavement sections out there. So we didn't want to do anything too permanent that was just going to be that ran the risk of being torn back out in a relatively short period of time. Next slide. Annandale and Gundry was one of the first projects we completed earlier this year. For those not familiar, this is a T intersection. Previously, it had a right slip lane and an island, a right turn slip lane and an island, made for a very pedestrian unfriendly crossing. It was rather unsafe. Most cars did not yield to the stop sign when turning right onto Gundry. So what we did, we came in here, we narrowed up the intersection, we put in bump outs, we paved it, put new striping down. And it's now a much more traditional T intersection with 25-foot wide pavement at the crosswalks, which is much improved from what it was. We've had many compliments from the neighborhood, and I think they're thoroughly enjoying it. Next slide. Another one we completed is West Jefferson Street. As you can see here, this was a speed bump and a significant amount of striping out there. So we did not remove any striping as part of this project. The side of the street that is hatched out was already signed as no parking. We just wanted to make that visible and delineate the two lanes. So to delineate the lanes, we didn't want it to appear like it was parking, which is why it's hatched out. But this has gone over really well. I think the residents have been extremely happy with this one. Just outside of the picture here, it turns into a commercial area, and cars kind of zoom up and down the street to get up to Little Falls there and kind of connect over into Arlington County and ultimately I-66. So this has gotten a lot of compliments as well. Next slide. All right, this was another one we added to the list. This was not a formal NTC project, but this was a remnant Safe Routes to School project that we did work with the community out on North Oak and Northwest to get some traffic calming benefit out of. And this is a series of actually 3 different crosswalks. The 2 pictures on your left are both of the intersection of Northwest and North Oak Street. We installed bump outs on both sides of the street, along with a rapid flashing beacon. Previously, this was a relatively long crosswalk, very low visibility, cars typically not going the speed limit, usually going about 7 to 8 miles faster. The rapid flashing beacon now gives an indication that somebody is trying to cross, which is very important when you have an elementary school at the end of the road with Mount Daniel. So that has been a big success. The residents are very appreciative of the rapid flashing beacon out there. And in the times that I've been out there monitoring it, it does work very well and it's very effective for slowing down traffic. The picture on the top right is at Northwest and Highland Ave. This was an ADA improvement that quite frankly, it needed to go in so that we had visibility for pedestrians trying to cross. What we did here was in essence install a bump out. You can see there's a little metal plate there to span over the gutter plate so stormwater can still run through. As I said, this is about a 5 to 6 foot bump out. It's been pretty effective. We do have some reflectors out there now for cyclists so that they know that there's in essence, a 6 cents grade change coming up rather quickly. Then the bottom picture here is at Northwest and Greenwich. This was a crosswalk that was originally installed on the other side of the street, and then it was removed for parking concern reasons. You're not really supposed to do that under ADA, so we went back out, we put a crosswalk in, we coordinated with the neighbor, the resident that lives across the street there to make sure that we were putting this crosswalk in a place that would have minimal effects on parking. And then with that, you can see one of the signs up for the pedestrian crosswalk. So now you've got 3 crosswalks in a row that all have high visibility, fluorescent yellow signage, brand new crosswalk markings, new ADA curb ramps, and all those features. And it's drastically changed the way cars have perceived the corridor. And it's had some good benefits for walkability and connectivity. Next slide. All right, and then this one is Seton Lane. As I said before, this one actually started out as just extending the missing link of sidewalk. It turned out it was actually more cost effective to remove some pavement. We didn't really mess with any parking out there, but we did do a 4-foot bump out that's about 80 feet long. So the intersection is a bit narrower, the crosswalks are narrower, and we do have a completely connected sidewalk grid out there now. As part of council's request, back when school was originally opening, we did expedite and advance some of the proposed heavy solutions for the Greenway Downs neighborhood to ensure that we weren't taking anything out or anything like that. The contractor did go, say they went a half a step too far. It turned out better for us, but you can see the picture on the bottom with the 2 utility poles in there. That corner was originally just intended to be painted and with some little plastic flexible post installed. They misunderstood, so they actually excavated that. It turned out pretty well for us. We were able to strike a discounted rate for that bump out, and it got us ADA compliance of just over 4 feet around those poles, as well as an improved bump out, curb ramp, and crosswalks in that area. So that turned out to be a bit of a blessing in disguise on that one. And while this is only half of the intersection, buses are still able to navigate. Cars do appear to be a little more compliant with the stop signs, but I think we can address the remaining issues with the larger neighborhood-wide project. Next slide. All right, and then this is South Maple Ave. Again, this was originally intended just to be a sidewalk behind the existing pavement. After getting out there, looking at it and talking it through with some contractors, we decided to actually reduce the pavement width. We had almost 15-foot lanes out there previously, which is quite excessive, especially on a street that's only signed for 25 miles an hour. So this is a project where the back of the sidewalk actually used to be the back of the curb. So we took out about a 4-foot section of pavement. We now have 11 to 12-foot lanes out there. Cars actually go quite a bit slower through here now. And I know that the neighborhood and the businesses not only appreciative of the extra connectivity, they also enjoy the historical markers that we installed, as well as the slower traffic. So this has been quite a benefit and quite a boost to the surrounding area. And this is something we do hope to continue in future years to get it down. Right now it ends at Wallace, and we do intend to extend this down to Tinner Hill in the same fashion by narrowing the existing pavement. Next slide. All right, and this is Nolan's. As you can see on your right, those are the signs that we installed. So shout out to Robert Goff and Kathy Allen for getting those installed for us. They did all that work in-house. On your left, you can see a picture of the new curb ramps we installed. That is the same place that we still need to stripe the crosswalk. Unfortunately, it got a little too cold for us by the time we had a paint crew in town, so we did have to skip that. But it is teed up, so once it warms up and we're starting to get temperatures consistently around 50 degrees, we'll be able to get that knocked out. So that won't take too long. That's not but a couple of hours of work. Next slide. All right, and this is the Great Falls and Little Falls neighborhood. Working through this with the working group and based off community feedback, this is our final plan, I guess I'll call it, of improvements. So starting down at Great Falls and Maple, it's really just a series of bump outs and curb ramp improvements. There are some miscellaneous stormwater items that get addressed through this just by the nature of what's there and realignments and such. Moving up to Little Falls and Great Falls, again, some bump outs. Some of the bump outs are needed just for ADA compliance. Others are because it's a slightly skewed intersection and there's some large turning radii and big intersection geometry, so trying to tighten that one up as well. And then finally, if you go up to Little Falls and Columbia, which is kind of the top right of the infographic there, this is various sidewalk widenings to create bump outs. There's some new crosswalks. There's a small section of sidewalk extension across the corner properties frontage there. And generally speaking, if we were to repave the street, we would probably be doing about half of this work regardless, just based off of the existing pedestrian features that are out there. So this really gives us an opportunity to improve the situation for all the pedestrians prior to repaving the street. As I said before, this is it is quite a large study area. This has been quite the challenge to try and get enough votes back for approval. So we've been working with the CACT. We are going to reduce this to 3 small study areas. I guess by doing that, we might be adding a couple houses in, but we'll be able to focus a much smaller area and kind of narrow that down. We are going to run the approvals concurrently with the hope that we're able to advance on all 3 at the same time. We don't want to start staggering them. If we stagger them, we're going to end up incurring about $15,000 to $20,000 more per location. So we could see about $40-ish plus $1,000 more if we did them all separately than if we're to combine them, which is significant when you consider the overall project is probably only about $220,000 to maybe $50,000 in estimated cost. Which is part of the reason why we're trying to keep them together. Next slide.
Zach, before I answer, I'm just going to comment that this one is one that I think suffered 2 ways in communication. I don't know if you can mute from them. I think feedback. One is it languished for a long time due to the funding constraints. And so then when we restarted it, it was like starting anew. And then COVID really added the complexities to this community engagement process for really getting the message out, allowing the community to come together and work through processes. I'm pleased with the staff work to really work on virtual meetings, put out yard signs, really re-engage. And in this last cycle, that's where it became clear that we needed a different path forward and the work then that Zach referenced with the CACT. Thanks for letting me add that in, Zach.
No, thanks, Sydney. And those are all good points. That is one of our oldest projects. So it's languished a little bit, and I think some residents have kind of lost interest, but all good points. Thank you for that, Cindy. The next project is Greenway Downs. As I said before, we're currently working with the neighborhood to establish the working group. But generally speaking, this is the project boundary that we're going to be working within. So you can see this is the 6 perpendicular streets to South Washington. It includes Seton Lane, and it also extends up to Timber right there at I'm not remembering my streets and I can't see the screen clearly enough. But it's one of the intersections that it's right turners heading, I guess that would be westbound. They don't slow down a whole lot. It's the kind of angled greater than 90 turn there is very conducive to higher speeds. So we wanted to make sure we were grabbing that intersection as well. And we've been working with a couple of residents who have been very involved for the last few months to get a neighborhood-wide survey to us as well as kind of fine tune what streets need to be included to ensure that we're not just moving problems onto a parallel street. That's not the intent of this project, nor is it the intent of the program to fix an issue on one street just to move it onto the other. So definitely looking at this holistically, and I won't necessarily say we're going to exactly mirror every street, but we're going to make sure that each street has how do I want to phrase that? Kind of an equitable balance to avoid that. I guess I'll put it that way. So as I said, this is fully grant funded. We will be sending out information to consultants in the next couple of weeks to start obtaining pricing, and then that will run concurrently while we're finalizing the working group. So next slide. All right, and then we've got South Oak, South Lee Street. I know this has probably been higher up on the radar for most of council. I do want to emphasize again that this is our newest project, which is why it's not quite as advanced as others. But you can see here, this is our light solutions plan. I do want to caveat this, that if you look in the lower kind of just off center to the left and the bend of South Lee Street, there are no parking signs with a double yellow, not at the intersection, yeah, right there. The no parking signs and the striping shown in the curve there are not going to be installed. This is a slightly older iteration of the map that we just haven't updated, but that is what the community's input has been. But you can see, you know, we're improving the school zone flasher signs. We've got some stripe bump outs at the intersection, and then we're also we're kind of highlighting the fact that there's a school zone ahead, as well as a speed sign, that a typical flashing radar speed sign that we have throughout town. And then one thing I do find quite interesting is that the residents asked to delineate lanes on this street. This is something that is possible to do. So through this stretch where the striping is shown, it's currently signed no parking. The reason for that is because there are not sufficient sight lines for two cars coming at each other. They can't see each other. So if that side did have parking, we would end up with about 14 feet of usable driving space. And without sufficient sight lines, we would run a very high risk of head-on collisions. So we cannot reconstitute the parking. It does have to stay restricted, but that does give us the benefit that we can, in essence, delineate the two lanes, which will help keep cars on their side of the street. One of the biggest complaints we receive from the residents there is that obviously people driving too quickly and then kind of overreacting while going up or down that hill. So we're expecting that paint work to help alleviate that. We are currently in the process of setting up and finalizing the working group to advance into heavy solutions. As I said before, I do have some concerns with getting some traffic data. I think very fortunately the NTC program is centered around speed data and less so volume data. So I think from that perspective, we'll still get some good data. We'll be able to determine some heavy solutions, whether it be speed humps, turning the painted bump outs into permanent curb extensions, or whatever it may be, to help some of the issues in the neighborhood. One thing I guess the only reason I have some concerns with the traffic data is that we are going to be looking at the intersection of South Oak and South Lee to see if a three-way stop sign is warranted. Just to make it clear with council, we do have to follow the MUTCD, which is the Manual of Uniform Traffic Control Devices. That covers what types of signs we can use, how we can install them, where we can install them, so on and so forth. That did undergo a revision several years ago. Prior to that revision, stop signs could be used to help control speed if it was deemed acceptable to do so by an engineer. The latest revision of the MUTCD no longer allows that. All-way stops can only be warranted either by in essence, congestion, or if there is a physical obstruction, such as a sightline issue, or something that prevents a car from safely turning in or out of a street. So we obviously, if we're going to be looking at this, we want to give that intersection the best chance of meeting that warrant. So we want to have a relatively high level of traffic. So I do have some concerns that we're going to get some low numbers. That said, I don't think the normal traffic would typically warrant a three-way stop. I think the deciding criteria is going to be whether those sightline issues I mentioned earlier, if those govern at this intersection or not. So I think it's just something we need to work through with the working group, and we just kind of need to get their approval before proceeding into, because we don't want to redo a study in 6 to 8 months because we didn't wait an extra couple of months. So we'll be working with the working group on those details, and we'll be making sure that we have an agreement of how to proceed before we get any traffic data. So next slide, please.
And as I transition that for you, Zach, I want to acknowledge that just past the service area towards the elementary school, we do have a pending grant applications for South Oak Street Bridge, which would improve the structurally deficit bridge and add pedestrian walkways and crosswalks. And that has been approved by the Commonwealth Transportation Board in their 6-year plan, except with COVID, they spread out the money over about 4 years, and which means we couldn't proceed with construction. So we've had some successful conversations so far, end of last week and this week, where it looks like we'll be advancing that money. That's a really important tie-in to this project and the Greenway Downs that Zach has been describing.
Yes, thank you, Cindy. That does connect both of those projects pretty well. So that's the status update of what we accomplished in calendar year 20. That kind of gives you an update on where we're at with all the projects. Again, there's only 3 that haven't advanced to construction: Great Falls, Little Falls neighborhood, the Greenway Downs neighborhood, and then the South Oak and South Lee neighborhood. So with that, I'll open it up to any questions.
All right, well, thank you very much. You've clearly been busy, and it looks like a lot of great work has occurred and is occurring now, so we appreciate that. Just sort of to set the table, this is meant as an update and not an extensive or detailed or lengthy discussion about traffic calming. We do have a couple more items to get to tonight, so if you could just keep that in mind when you ask your questions or make your comments. Jim Snyder has had his hand up before Dave Snyder. So, Jim, did you have something you wanted to say?
No, I didn't. You may have meant Dave Snyder.
Okay, well, your hand was up, but anyway, that's fine. Dave, what do you got?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. A couple things. First of all, thank everyone for this small amount of work. The South Maple work is good, but what you see is where it runs out. You end up on an asphalt parking lot where if you continued walking where the sidewalk goes, you'd have to walk through a parked truck. So I'm wondering if you couldn't take a look at that, where that continues on south, because again, it feeds right out into an asphalt parking lot where there's a line drawn on the parking lot, but a truck parked right over someone would walk. So I think a little bit of low-key, low-cost work might show some good results there. Secondly, South Oak and South Lee continue to be a major issue and a lot of discussion there. So we appreciate continued work and all that. Finally, at the Citizens Advisory Committee on Transportation meeting last week, I was astounded to hear that new legislative authority to create automated speed enforcement in school zones have been unilaterally rejected by staff. And I want to bring that back. I think it ought to come before City Council. If there are problems with the underlying statute that authorizes it, I think we ought to deal with that in our legislative program. Since most of these projects are relating to speed, the fact that we're not using legislative authority we have for automated speed enforcement seems counterproductive, to say the least, if not worse. So I'll be interested in a full explanation of how the city is going to use that authority. And this was presented by a longtime chair of CACT. So if there are some factual problems, I'd be interested in knowing that. Thank you.
Yeah, so to address your first point with the Maple Ave sidewalk, that does need a curb ramp still installed at it. That curb ramp will be installed in such a manner to where when that sidewalk extends and continues down to Tinner Hill, that it won't have to be removed. So that'll help. And then as a worst case scenario, we would delineate as you mentioned, the asphalt parking lot that has the line on it. We would delineate that either via the flexible reflective posts or some parking stops to ensure that there's a sufficient walking path to continue. Obviously, the intention is to continue the sidewalk down to Tinner Hill. As for the last,
and I'll jump in on the camera enforcement, and Chief Gavin might as well. I think the issue is just in terms of staffing the procurement process. And with Photo Red, the city actually took the lead in contracting those services for Photo Red enforcement, and almost all of Northern Virginia and much of the state rode the city's contract because we did such good work on it. I think it is incredibly time consuming. And so we are looking for one of our peer jurisdictions to take the lead in initiating that procurement. And then hopefully the city can ride one of their contracts without us having to do all of that labor, as we've done to the benefit of the region with Photo Red. So that's it's not that there's any, I don't think there are any other problems with it. We do have pretty stern staffing challenges right now, and just in the priorities, we've not been able to move that procurement forward.
Mr. Mayor, I want to follow up on that, because our citizens have said repeatedly that speeding traffic is one of their #1 safety concerns. So I remain unconvinced by this justification. And I hope that we'll get much faster action than is being planned at this point. Thank you.
All right, Mr. Lichtenhouse.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. Zach, thanks for that. And thanks for the work you guys did on Seaton. I think it looks great, and certainly excited to see Greenway Downs. Just a quick follow-up. What do you expect the timing to be for South Oak and South Lee? I mean, that's just an incredibly dangerous stretch and intersection right there. I see it on a daily basis. So what's the timing on that?
Yeah, so the light solutions, again, as soon as it warms up and we get that paint on the ground, several of the signs that are installed have supporting ground markings that have to be installed as well. Mm-hmm. So as soon as it warms up, we'll have guys out there getting everything installed, striped out, all of that.
What about that intersection?
Yes, in terms of same thing with the light solutions anyway.
Okay.
It'll all be done in one go.
Okay.
Yeah, we just don't have the temperatures right now for that paint to stick.
So we're talking spring?
Yeah, unfortunately, yes, it'll have to be early spring.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, it can't come soon enough. And I would ask if there's anybody from police or sheriff's department still on the line, if you guys could put some enforcement on Oak Street. If I see another pizza delivery driver use Oak Street like a drag strip burning through stop signs, I'm going to start making citizen arrests myself like Barney Fife. So if somebody could get out there and put some enforcement specifically for pizza delivery drivers, if you were listening, we got to slow traffic down on that strip before somebody gets killed. Thank you.
All right, Vice Mayor Connolly.
Zach, thank you. Thank you for all of those descriptions and pictures. It's really exciting how much work you've gotten done this year. And I really appreciate your creative use of financing as well to get the most done and the most bang for our buck. My question will come as no surprise to Ms. Mester, and that is just around communication to the neighborhoods. She mentioned, I think, the Maple, Great Falls, Little Falls neighborhood communication. And I just want to make sure that that is that there's a consistent way of communicating with neighborhoods, because like Greenway Downs is a big neighborhood, and I want to make sure that all the neighbors know what's happening and know when they can weigh in. The survey that went out didn't go to all the neighbors; it went to some neighbors as a way to get started. But I just want to make sure that there's a way that your planning includes that neighborhood outreach.
Yes. So pre-COVID, we would actually go around and hang door flyers and see if we could talk to anybody. During COVID, that isn't the best way to do it. So we've resorted to snail mail and mailing through USPS packets and information and all of the applicable documents so somebody can make an informed decision. So it has slowed down the process, especially on the larger study area groups. But the smaller areas, kind of, I'll say more traditionally sized NTC projects, it hasn't appeared to slow it down too much. And then that goes back, establishing the working groups for these heavy solutions. That seems to have kind of made up for some of the lag we've seen with the mailings. Only working with a couple of folks, obviously it's easier to coordinate meetings. And then they can go out and they can talk to the neighborhood and keep excitement going. But as far as the actual voting itself, we do typically send out via USPS.
And Zach, maybe you could expand a little bit for Greenways Downs. That's such a large area with the number of streets. We have been very strategically thinking about how to have a representative working group who then works back to their own streets, so we make sure we don't miss people. And we are working hard to collect email addresses, which I know was a suggestion that council provided much earlier in this process for adding that to the petitions. Because especially with COVID, we've been trying to use emails a lot more. But if we don't have an email, that's when we do the snail mail or ask the working group. But we have to be careful during COVID what we ask people, so it's a little tenuous, but totally concur with Ms. Conley on the importance of communication. And with Greenways Down being a little different, it might be helpful to talk about that, Zach.
Yeah, so Greenway Downs is a bit different. We do have, I think, 2, maybe 3, but I know 2 residents for sure throughout the entire study area that they've really been coordinating to get that survey out to as many folks as possible. We are going to structure the working group. It's not going to be the traditional working group with 3 or 4 people on a street. If we did that, we'd end up with, I think, like 30 or 40 people, which is just an impossible task. So we are going to kind of divide it up. We're going to take the average length street and assign and say, I'll use like Marshall Ave, for example, right? So let's say that's the average length street. That street will get 2 working group representatives, and then that'll fluctuate up or down depending on the length of the street. We think that'll limit the group size to about 15 plus or minus total people, which is very workable. And I think that's going to be a pretty good plan moving forward and working with a large group, but a much smaller group than what we would traditionally have.
And then we'll ask each working group member to make sure they're communicating 100% to everybody on their street. And then, as Zach mentioned earlier, there'll be a holistic approach to the solutions, which may not mirror 100% to each street, but it will ensure no spillover from an engineering standpoint. But each street will have a voice in what's actually constructed there. And I do want to be clear, the survey that was done was neighborhood community initiated, And so it was great because they spent a lot of time and got input. But if 100% of the people weren't reached, that was through their outreach effort. And whenever we do something, we will do 100% to the physical addresses, or if we have an email. We actually map the houses with emails to make sure we don't miss anybody.
Yes, and that's a good point to make, Cindy. The survey that was received, that's setting the baseline so that we have something to give to our consultants. Say, hey, here's what we want to look at to start with, and then from there it'll be an iterative process with the entirety of the working group. We'll set up a couple of different meetings. We'll work through the details, and again, we'll balance out the streets so that nobody has this bright idea that, oh, I don't want to go down Marshall anymore. I'm just going to go down Greenway Boulevard because I don't have to deal with X, Y, and Z and then just cut over Seton real quick. That we want to make sure we're avoiding that kind of bypass. So, you know, all of that will be addressed with the working group, and it will be an iterative process. And then, as Cindy said, the working group will have to coordinate with the remainder of their street to get word out and alert other residents of kind of what's going on and the status of everything, at least until that vote comes due.
Got it. Ms. Hardy?
Thank you. So first of all, Zach, thank you for all this work. Clearly, you guys have been busy. I am especially appreciative of you all trying to get that sidewalk completed on Seton and kind of straightening up that intersection, which I know has been long requested. Having observed, I guess, the kids when they were in school and all the extra pedestrians, I do think that as a whole, the city is getting so much value out of these pedestrian improvements and traffic calming projects. We just have so many people who now work from home and are using kind of streets throughout the day. So I do think that the effort that we've invested here is totally worth it. So on that note, Cindy, how much are we allocating currently in the budget for traffic calming and sidewalks?
The neighborhood traffic calming current adopted CIP has $100,000 per year, and the sidewalks mirror that for every year except for the current year, which was at $180,000, and then currently in FY22 and on is $100,000. We will be assessing that as we're looking at the current CIP because we do have two streets, Midvale, which came out of the Nolan project, and South Lee, where sidewalks, a missing sidewalk may be beneficial to the safety issues, and that's separate from the NTC. Those are very expensive sidewalks for which there's not sufficient funding. And I will remind council just that this year's sidewalk streetlight money is going to streetlights, and we're making really good progress on final designs with Zach and Lionel's leadership, and we're taking out the updated plans from the site visit to actually see the lights to 5 or 6 boards and commissions, and then we'll be able to report back to council.
Got it. So I'm hearing it was 200,000 total, so 100,000 for traffic calming and 100 for sidewalks.
Yeah.
So as we look at the queue, I know that you've kind of gotten the mandate from council to clear the queue, and while we have no new projects, I would encourage us to kind of keep the funding, if not increase it, to get to more of those sidewalk projects as the budget allows. As I said, I don't think that the demand is going to go away. I do think traffic will pick up again, and we're probably going to see requests kind of come out of the woodwork again. I think just in the past 10 or 11 months, obviously traffic just hasn't been as bad, and everyone's just been too consumed and busy and probably haven't prioritized it. But I would not expect that the problem is solved just because we're getting through the queue. So as we think about budget, let's make sure that that stays, if not increases, to get to this. And while we were talking about VCs, I did note that in one of the slides, we talked about how on top of the annual operating budget that we set aside for this work, there was some money from 301 West Broad. So that is another good example, again, of how we use voluntary concessions as part of the kind of the overall funding mechanism for, you know, good work across the city. I wanted to bring up Annandale Big Chimneys because I thought that was one that would be funded out of 301 West Broad concessions. Is there still going to be, I guess, traffic calming work in front of Big Chimneys when it opens? Is that
so that's part of the Big Chimneys project, actually.
Okay, it's not called out as part of NTC.
Correct. The NTC money that we received from 301 West Broad is, in essence, it's not fully funding, but it's partially funding the work that happened at Annandale and Gundry. And then it is, some of the money is being allocated to other pedestrian improvements some curb ramps kind of around the facility that if we were to approve the project today, we would have had them replaced. So given that it hadn't been all that long since the facility came online, it was, I guess the best way to put it is when the facility came online, it fell into a bit of a gray zone with some ADA changes. And because we had the money available, we felt it best to go ahead and address some of the possible liabilities from the ADA changes, because ADA doesn't go by project approval, it goes by when it was constructed.
So beyond, I guess, what's already there at Gundry, do we expect any, like a raised crosswalk or speed bump in front of Big Chimney's entrance?
No. So Big Chimneys is constructing a bump out on the park side. Unfortunately, we did remove the raised crosswalk there, but that was for stormwater concerns. We didn't have anywhere to push the stormwater off. And then I do not believe we're doing a bump out on the Harris Teeter side. I'm not 100% on that. I'd have to go back and look at what we decided to do. I know there's some ramps being updated so that we're 100% in the clear on any ADA concerns that we have.
Got it. Because I think the Gundry improvements are great, but you still kind of have that wide stretch of street essentially from the light on South Maple and Annandale kind of going past the park. And I hate to open the park in the next month or two, and I want to make sure that we're getting people there safely.
Yes, and I should add too that some of that voluntary concession money, if you go all the way down to Annandale and Maple, some of that concession money does address some restriping so that there's no longer 2 through lanes on Annandale. One of the lanes will become a right turn lane. So you'll only have 1 through lane. That should help. I know right now, if you go out there, you've got, I'll say the cars in the curb lane, they know that lane ends. And they get in like a little mini drag race to try and beat out a car or two.
Yes.
So we're hoping to eliminate that issue with some of the striping work we've got planned.
Thank you. I'm glad we're thinking of creative ways to address this. While we're on paint, when Park Avenue was redone over the fall, the bike Sharrow markings weren't put back in. So in the spring, hopefully we can get that back in because again, we're seeing just as many bicyclists out and about too.
Yes. So in the spring, we are planning on repaving the remainder of Park Ave from Virginia up to Founders Row, the sections that didn't get paved. And as part of that repaving, we'll be installing all the markings at once. So all those bike Sharrows will be going back.
Okay. And I did want to add another voice of support to what Dave Snyder said around supporting kind of automated speed enforcement. So I know that while it sounds like we have some resource issues in getting that up and running, I do think in the long run, given the volume of complaints we get on speeding, that could probably help us hopefully resource-wise. So to the extent that council can help support that, let us know what we need to do. Last comment is around our commercial areas and kind of traffic calming and ped safety. So we had that unfortunate kind of accident with several pedestrians on Broad Street, and I think it might have been Annandale, in the fall. And we had talked about either testing out additional LPIs, adding kind of no turn on red or full protected walk signals. I still would love to prioritize those things because they don't require paint, money, or funding. These are hopefully things that we can do with existing traffic signals and signs. And I do think that, again, that as we see more pedestrians out and about, it's important for us to think about prioritizing them first. And so if it means cars are a little slower and it takes them more time to get from one end of the city to the other, I'd be willing to make that trade-off because I do think it's, again, we should be prioritizing pedestrian safety. So we don't need to do it tonight, but I'd love to know kind of where we are at evaluating additional intersections that can have LPI treatments or turn on red, or better yet, kind of full protected walks so that only pedestrians are allowed to cross and there's no cars turning. Because when I'm running through the city, I've had frequent near misses where a car is turning, even if I have the right of way. And I know that I'm probably not the only one with that experience.
Yeah, so I will say we are working on getting some signs up at Annandale and Broad for no right on red on all 4 approaches. We've had some quarantine issues up at the property yard, so we've been a bit delayed on some of that stuff. But that aside, I'm not a traffic engineer, so I won't dive into details, but we have talked to our consultant. If we wanted an all red for just a pedestrian phase, we would have to significantly retime all of our signals. That's not to say it can't be done, but it's going to take an investment of money to redo those timings. I believe the newest timings were just implemented early last year. LPIs we can look at again. Those are much easier to incorporate than an all red for a pedestrian crossing. So we'll look into that, and I'll get back with council.
Great. And if it means that we can time it with, the next time that the signals need to be updated, I think I'm certainly open to just piloting it, because I know that it does take work, even if it's not as costly as concrete and whatnot. So thank you very much, Zach. I appreciate all the hard work.
Absolutely. And just for, I guess, everybody's knowledge, we do try and update signal timings every 3 to 5 years. So we're not that far away from needing to do it again. So if it's something we want to look at holistically and make sure the whole corridor is timed in a fashion, especially through that section of Broad there, because we do have a few intersections that are super close. If we want to make sure the timings are right so that whether it's an LPI or whatever it may be comes on, we just want to make sure traffic's not backing up into the next intersection while it's red for that direction. So there's some coordination that can take place as part of a larger scale project, make it a bit easier as well.
That sounds good. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Are there any last comments? And we do have several other items tonight. If not, I want to thank you. This is great. There's tons of good things happening. I think it's aligned with everything we on council have been speaking about over these past years. So a lot of good work. We look forward to more, and thank you so much. I would like to take a recess now. Let's say a 5-minute recess, and we'll reconvene at 10:36 and get on with the rest of the agenda. So we'll take a short break. Thank you.
All right, FCC TV is showing live, and let me just pause a moment and Celeste see if Granicus is caught up. All right, I believe you're good to go, Mayor.
All right, well, it's 10:36, I guess now 10:37. We are ready to reconvene and are reconvening our work session. So now we're moving on to the next item on the agenda, which is a security briefing by our police chief. Chief Gavin, are you on the line?
Yes, I am.
Okay, well, welcome, and thank you for sticking around and joining us this evening.
No problem. Good evening, council. I'm going to keep this short and concise. Just wanted to update you on three sections of security briefing. One would be the intelligence in and around this past week's activities and the inauguration activities, the traffic patterns in and around the National Capital Region that will affect Falls Church, and lastly, the city government posture as we move into the inauguration tomorrow. Obviously in the intelligence, we've been receiving intelligence every day, several times a day, and the last intelligence update I got was at 10 o'clock this evening in regards to the inauguration and obviously the situation or the insurrection on January 6th. We all know it as being one of the most widely documented crimes in the United States, and from open sources, it would show this nation that our greatest threat is white supremacy, neo-Nazi, far-right extremists. And so that is the biggest threat moving into this week. And as a region, we have worked each and every day and every day of the week trying to fortify the Commonwealth. We've met, every chief and sheriff have met face-to-face throughout the week on different aspects of the regional's position and posture. You should know that there is no direct threat to Northern Virginia, and there is no direct threat to the city of Falls Church. Things that should be noted, there was chatter and discussion in and around January 6th and immediately thereafter by some of these extremist groups to disrupt transportation, maybe trains, planes, vehicular traffic into DC and to disrupt the inauguration. As we've seen with the fortification of DC this past week, there are two major zones. One is a red zone where there are no cars or hardly any people that are being able to go down to the National Mall. And then there's a green zone that has only vehicles with credentials to be entered. All of the bridges into DC have some type of closure. 14th Street Bridge, the Memorial Bridge, the Teddy Roosevelt Bridge are all closed. Chain Bridge and Key Bridge will remain open and will be modified as state police, Arlington County, and DC sees fit. All of the Northern Virginia regional police and sheriffs are in cooperation with this. All the jurisdictions are working with Arlington County and Virginia State to close these roadways. Also to enhance security at all the airports locally. Outside of DC, some of the focal points of concern in some of the chatter was government facilities, federal buildings, state buildings, and some local buildings. Nothing specific. Hence, that takes us to this region and why we have fortified the traffic patterns as we should have. And each and every police department, sheriff's office throughout this region has taken a posture of upstaffing for tomorrow. For the city, we will be doubling our staffing, canceling days off for tomorrow for everyone. So we'll have double the amount of officers and sheriffs on the street and in and around City Hall throughout the day and night tomorrow. Our activities will be essentially high profile in the community, patrolling high surveillance of the high school, the hotels, the shopping centers, and some of the special landmarks in the city. We'll have response teams in case we have any type of assaults, protests, or any assemblies. We had one small assault or crowd in a shopping center right after the Trump rally. It wasn't specific to the Trump rally activities, but it was politically motivated. So as you can see, I mean, DC is shut down completely. We have asked for the city to go to more online services, and so keeping people at home, keeping them off the street, and ensuring that the public safety can focus on keeping the community safe and especially our employees here at work. With just the outside chance of any type of government facilities being a focal point, out of an abundance of caution, the city has agreed to allow many of the employees to telework tomorrow. And so that's it in a nutshell. I'm here for any questions you may have in regards to the region and or specifically to the city.
All right. Well, thank you, Chief Gavin, and we appreciate all your efforts and the police force's efforts to keep us safe and the region safe. We know these are pretty crazy times we live in. Are there any questions for Chief Gavin? All right. Well, looks like we've got one. Let me see who that is here real quick. Ms. Conley.
Yes, thanks, Chief Gavin, for that report. I'm wondering if there have been any messages that have gone out to businesses in the community so that they're alert to what's going on and what your plans are.
Good question. We did have I had an exchange with Sally Cole this evening in regards to, us closing the, City Hall. There has been no specific, what they call chatter or threat to businesses and private businesses in this environment. But as I told Sally, we need to circle back with the chamber and or with Becky Witzman and talk about, man-made disasters, and particularly in civil unrest type environments. We've done a lot with active shooter and those type of incidents with our community, but we haven't done a lot around civil unrest. And so where she is aware of what we're doing and why we're taking the posture we are, because specific threats are towards government, there has been nothing specific to the businesses. Now, having said that, it's not as if we haven't put resources out in the community to surveil our business district to ensure that it's secure and or that we can be watching it. So we have done that.
Thanks.
All right. Are there other questions for Chief Gavin? All right. Well, thank you so much. And please keep us informed as to what's going on. And we know these are difficult times we live in. And again, thank you for your efforts.
Thank you.
All right. Let's move on now to the next item, which is second quarter financial reports. Ms. Bawa, are you on the line?
Good evening, Mayor Tartar. Yes, I am. I will try to be brief. This second quarter results for the first 6 months of fiscal year 2021 were discussed at the Budget and Finance Committee on last Friday, January 15th. And overall, the revenues for the first 6 months are 1% over the budgeted amount, the target, and we are still seeing mixed results for some of the categories. A quick highlight, sales tax is still holding steady with boost from grocery and internet sales. Meals tax has performed in the second quarter better than the first quarter and has met its budget target for this year. It was trailing the last quarter. Some of the other taxes, such as communications and utility taxes, have performed better than before. They're still negative, however, lesser negative, I should say. Fines and forfeitures are still below budget, but picking up, but still significantly below budget. Expenditures are 1% below the budget, and at this current time, all departments are showing spending within their budget targets. We do have significant amount of contracts, cyclical in nature, that come in the third and the fourth quarter. So staff continues to monitor the revenues as well as the expenditures. And the next glimpse for the council will be roughly 8 months of data, which will be incorporated in the city manager's budget proposal that will be brought to you in early part of March. And with that, I'll conclude. And if there are any questions, we'd be happy to address those.
All right, let's see if there are any questions. Any questions for Ms. Bawa? So I guess while we're waiting to see if anyone has any, you've just said revenues are 1%. If my recollection serves correctly, I thought we were budgeting for 2.5%. Is that on an annualized basis, the 1% number you gave us?
So, Mayor Tartar, this 1% is for the current fiscal year. Actuals are showing 1% performance over our budget that we set in May after COVID hit. The 2.5% is for the next year's budget. That shows the real estate. The big chunk of it is the real estate assessments, and also other taxes such as sales tax and I think recordation that has been holding. So we've incorporated all those for the next year's. And next year when we brought the projections, the preliminary projections to council in December, we are projecting as of that 2.5% increase in tax revenue for fiscal year 22 over the 21 budget.
But the numbers we've just got, do those have implications either for your estimates or what you believe is coming for next year?
I am going to review, of course, the next year projections, but we are pretty much in the ballpark for most of the categories that are we are looking at. But some of these are so time bound, like meals tax. I want to see how the winter months are going to show up. The January and February are going to be quite meaningful in our projections for with the winter months. And then if any of the, COVID increase, number of cases have increased, if any executive order is given, and if there are any changes due to that, it will impact our revenues, and we will keep refining those. As of right now, I feel that 2.5% is looking good. However, we will incorporate more latest data, the January and February, and bring you something more up to date in March.
Ms. Hardy, thank you.
Thanks. My first question is actually what you already said, Dave, is whether this changes any of our thinking in FY22. Sounds like Karen just said, still feeling fine about it, but we'll look at more data. Karen, as it relates to abatements and tax relief, I saw that in the memo. That's where we saw, I guess, variations from what we expected on real estate tax revenue.
That's correct.
Is that something that we're going to have to account for more of in FY22 as well?
A big chunk of it was one particular commercial property. And yes, that is something we do visit when we do the budget, and we adjust our amounts. And I would like to see, we have collected the first property tax payment. However, the appeals that come make up most of the abatements, and we are done with those appeals for the current fiscal year, the ones that come, and it is a larger number, and I will like to review what we budget for next year. Yes.
And specifically, I guess on the individual side, that was like the senior property tax relief that we had expanded, correct?
That's correct. Yeah, and that got overspent by 75,000. Yes.
Okay. And I guess on that note, given that there's just still so much unknown, I think I'll just reiterate a point I made when we issued guidance, which is I think the numbers seem fine for kind of what we think the fairway estimate, but I do think it would be prudent for us to have an eye on what the range of scenarios would look like. So if things don't turn out as well as 2.5%, I know it's more work to obviously create a budget for every scenario, but I think we should keep an eye on what might things look like if things go up and down, depending on what the next 3 or 4 months of data looks like.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
All right. Any other questions or comments from Ms. Bawa? Okay. Thank you to the Budget and Finance Committee. I know you guys have noodled this before it came to us, and so we appreciate that. Ms. Bawa, thank you. Keep your your eyes on what's going on, and we certainly look forward to hearing more information from you. This is certainly one of the more unusual years, and so I think it bears greater attention. But thank you very much for your fine work. Let's move on now to council schedule and council comments. Do people have any comments? Any committee reports, anything they'd like to speak to before we adjourn our meeting? Ms. Hardy?
Thanks, Mayor. Wyatt, I did have a request. So I thought tonight would have been a good opportunity for us to invite our boards and commissions to join us, like the CACT for NTC and obviously the Housing Commission and maybe HSAC for the ADU discussion at the beginning. So if we can give some thought on where we might want to feather them into the work session schedule, even while we're in virtual, I think we'd benefit from having dialogue with our boards and commission members.
Yeah, it's a good point. Thank you.
Mr. Duncan?
The Economic Development Committee meeting on the, excuse me, I think it's the 28th. Somebody help me with the calendar. Is scheduled at the same time that the VML is having a local government day webinar. So I'd like to ask my fellow EDC meeting colleagues if we could meet in the afternoon of that day. So think about that on your schedule and let me know.
It works for me, Bill.
Shoot, where's the calendar? So that's the 28th. instead of 9 o'clock on the 28th, we could do it maybe 1 o'clock or so. I don't know how that works for those of you with the school challenge. Anyway, let me know. I can't meet on Friday that week for for another thing I have to do.
1 o'clock's fine for me, Phil.
Okay.
All right, Mr.
I
Snyder.
think it should be fine.
Sure, thanks. I'd like us to schedule in the near future a discussion of automated speed enforcement and how we can take advantage of that legislation and move rapidly to implement it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Are there other comments or questions or scheduling items? I know we'll be getting together in the next 10 hours. So it may not be.
That was my question. Are you going to have a mayor's scheduling meeting in the morning? Yes.
I mean, I assumed so. Mr. Shields is there. I mean, I know tomorrow is inauguration day, and it may be a holiday. I don't even know. Is it a holiday, by the way, Mr. Shields?
No, it is not a holiday, and Celeste has sent out the team's invitation for the mayor's meeting at 8:30 tomorrow.
All right. Well, then in another 9.5 hours, we can talk about any scheduling we miss right now. Is there any final words anybody wants to say before we adjourn tonight? Okay. Well, we'll see most of you tomorrow morning at the mayor's meeting at 8:30. And for the rest of you, thanks for joining us this evening. And unless there's anything further, let's go ahead and adjourn.